They called it a retreat gift, an exclusive private island just for me. But as the only boat began to sink with holes drilled intentionally, I realized this wasn't a gift. This was a custom-designed tomb. My architect daughter-in-law designed it, and my own son agreed to it. They calculated everything: my old age, the isolation, and most importantly, my mortal fear of water. They wanted me to die within days. But they were wrong. My name is Clara Mae Thompson, and 12 years later, I came back to reclaim it all. If you are listening from anywhere in the world, leave a comment and subscribe, because there are truths that need to be spread, even if they shake your beliefs. There are stories, no matter how painful, that must be told. I was born in the land of artisanal sourdough and the Gold Rush Trail in Grass Valley, California. But for many years, I've lived here at the Hopewell Ranch, near Lake Oroville. Life has its twists and turns, you see. From a nurse who saved lives in the Korean War in the 50 seconds, I became a producer of the most award-winning cheeses in the state. I had every reason to be enjoying my old age in peace, but I ended up a prisoner on a small island that my daughter-in-law Charlotte built, saying it was a surprise gift for the mother-in-law she loved so much. A gift? It was a grave, that's what it was. A coffin surrounded by water on all sides, custom-made for an old woman with a phobia of water, who can barely look at a puddle without her heart racing. It was in 2010 that it all happened. I remember it like it was yesterday. My daughter-in-law, Charlotte, was one of those trendy architects who are always talking about sustainability and innovative projects. She showed up all excited one Sunday afternoon. "Mrs. Thompson, I have a surprise for your 70th birthday. I built something special in the middle of the lake. A retreat just for you. A cabin on a private island." At that moment, a chill ran from my toes to the top of my head. An island in the middle of Lake Oroville? Me, of all people, who had been terrified of water since I was a girl, when I almost drowned in the Yuba River. But she insisted so much, and my son Ethan seemed so excited about his wife's idea that I ended up agreeing to at least go see it. "Just a look. You don't have to stay if you don't like it," she assured me. The next morning, the three of us boarded a small boat. I was shaking like a leaf, clinging to every possible surface. The island wasn't very far from the ranch's shore. You could even see the main house from there. It was small, no more than 3,000 square feet, a perfect circle with a little wooden cabin in the center. Everything was very charming, with flowers, a little porch, even a small garden. "We did everything thinking of you, Mom. It even has your favorite seeds in the little garden," Ethan said as he helped me disembark. Charlotte smiled the whole time, showing me every little corner. "See? I left fruit, supplies, everything you like. You can spend the day here whenever you want, peace and quiet. We even brought that book you were reading. You know when you feel a shiver down your spine? I felt it." They convinced me to have coffee on the porch. While we were admiring the view, they said they needed to get the rest of the surprise from the shore. "We'll be back in half an hour," they promised. And me, a foolish old woman, I believed them. I watched the boat move away, my son rowing and my daughter-in-law waving with a smile. That was the last time I saw them for a very, very long time. An hour passed, then two. By the third hour, I started screaming, calling for help. But who would hear me? The ranch was isolated, with no neighbors nearby, and the island was just far enough that my voice couldn't reach the shore. That's when I noticed something strange in the water, near the small dock. Something was sinking. It was the boat. I had to gather all my courage to get close to the edge and confirm it. They had drilled holes in the bottom of the boat on purpose. It was no accident. I saw the clear marks of holes made with some kind of tool. Despair took hold of me at that moment. That's the moment. The click. The realization that this wasn't an accident, but a meticulously planned execution. Her own family. How does a 70-year-old woman even begin to process that? Keep listening to find out how Clara fights back against despair. The despair hit hard, but it wasn't just about dying. You see, that was my son, my own flesh and blood. The pain of being thrown out like trash by the very child you raised. That feeling cuts deeper than any knife, and it hurt more than my mortal fear of the water ever did. I collapsed onto a chair on the porch, my heart trying to beat out of my chest, my hands trembling so much I dropped the coffee cup I was still holding. I finally understood everything. The cabin stocked with enough food for a few days. The strategic location, far enough that I couldn't swim to shore, even if I knew how, which I didn't. No communication, nothing. A perfect plan to get rid of an old woman and inherit the Hopewell Ranch, which was worth millions. The ranch. Ah, my century-old ranch. That piece of land had a history, you see. It had been in my late husband Henry's family for over 100 years, when the first Thompsons came from the Midwest to raise cattle in the California foothills. Over time, it became a benchmark for artisanal cheeses, especially after I took over following Henry's death in 2005. I applied all the technical knowledge I had, mixed it with the Californian traditions I brought from Grass Valley, and revolutionized production. Our artisanal Monterey Jack won international awards. It was even served at dinners at the governor's mansion. It was a gold mine, and Charlotte knew it. Ethan was an only child, the heir to everything. If I died naturally on an isolated island, with no witnesses, who would suspect a thing? Night began to fall, and with it, the July chill of the foothills. I went into the cabin trembling, but not just from the cold. It was fear, pure panic. I looked around. There was a small bed, some groceries in the cramped kitchen, candles, matches, some basic clothes. Charlotte had paid attention to the details to make it look like a retreat, not a prison. I searched everything for something that could help me. A radio, a phone, anything. Nothing. I only found a small notebook and a pencil. For you to write down your thoughts, she had said. Ah, Charlotte, so clever and so cruel. Did she want me to record my final days, to document my own end? I spent that first night wide awake, huddled in a corner of the bed, listening to the sound of the water lapping against the island. Every sound startled me. The wind in the wooden cracks sounded like whispers. The shadows moved like ghosts. But the worst was the water, always the water. That irrational fear that had haunted me since I was 7, when I fell in the river and almost didn't make it back. So convenient for my daughter-in-law's plans. She knew that even if the island was close to the shore, I would never try to swim. The terror paralyzed me just thinking about it. With the first light of morning, I went to the porch and looked at the ranch in the distance. I could see movement at the main house, tiny figures walking back and forth. My life, my home, so close and yet so far. That's when it really sank in. They weren't coming back for me. It wasn't forgetfulness. It wasn't an accident with the boat. It was planned, premeditated abandonment. I looked at the crystal clear water of Lake Oroville surrounding that tiny piece of land, and I felt a chill. How did an artificial island get there? I later found out. Charlotte had paid a fortune to an environmental engineering firm, convincing them it was an ecological project approved by environmental agencies. Lies, of course. Bribes, probably. Sounds crazy, doesn't it? Building an entire island in the middle of a public lake. But with enough money and sweet-talking lies, Charlotte could pull off anything. She sold them some story about an ecological project when what she was really building was a tomb tailor-made just for me. I sat on the porch and did what anyone would do. I cried. I cried from anger, from fear, from frustration. Then I dried my tears and started to think. I hadn't survived a war to die at the hands of an ambitious daughter-in-law. In Korea, I saw horrors most people can't even imagine. I cared for soldiers torn apart by bombs. I operated by candlelight in field hospitals. I improvised medical equipment with whatever I had on hand. If I survived that, I would survive this island. I did a mental inventory. I had stored drinking water for a few days, canned food and fruit for maybe a week, a small gas stove with a propane tank that would last a month if I was frugal. It wasn't much, but it was a start. What worried me most were my medications. I had only brought my blood pressure pills in my purse, enough for 3 days. The others, for arthritis, for my heart, were left at home. "You won't need them, Grandma. It's just a quick trip," Charlotte had said when I asked. Calculating. She knew exactly what she was doing. Without her medication, a 70-year-old woman with a heart condition wouldn't last long under stress. That wasn't just abandonment. That was a calculated death sentence. Charlotte had counted every last pill. She didn't just want me dead, she wanted me to die naturally from my own ailments. But she forgot one crucial thing. I was a MASH nurse. I survived Korea. I wasn't about to go down that easy. The plan was brutally perfect. The following days were a forced adaptation. I rationed food as I had learned in the war. 1 can of corn became 2 meals. A piece of fruit was eaten slowly. The water stored in jugs was the most precious commodity. I discovered that the cabin's roof had a rainwater collection system. The architect's work, of course. At least there was that. But we were in the dry season of the foothills, and the rains wouldn't come for months. The first jug ran out in 5 days. 2 were left. At night, when the temperature dropped, I would wrap myself in the few available blankets and look out the windows. I could see the lights of the ranch. Once, I swore I saw fireworks. Were they celebrating my disappearance? Or was it my imagination already playing tricks on me after days of solitude? The silence was deafening. The only constant sound was the water. Water that terrified me. Water that held me prisoner. Water that, ironically, I needed to survive. I used the notebook Charlotte left not to record laments, but to plan. In Korea, I learned that survival is a matter of strategy. List resources, identify threats, establish priorities. First page, water and food. Second, signals for rescue. Third, natural remedies. Fourth, defense and tools. I wasn't going to surrender easily to the fate my daughter-in-law had planned. Each page became a survival project. In the second week, I started to notice patterns. In the morning, a fishing boat passed in the distance, but as regular as a clock. Too late for me, unfortunately. By the time I realized, I had already used all my colorful shirts to wave, without success. They were too far away. In the afternoon, now and then, pleasure boats crossed the lake, but also far from the island. At night, the silence was total. I tried to make a signal fire, but the available wood was scarce, and the smoke wasn't enough to attract attention. My daughter-in-law had chosen the location well, visible from the ranch but outside the common boating routes on Lake Oroville. And with the reputation she had created for me in the area, an elderly lady with dementia, who imagines things who would believe it if someone saw me screaming for help on an island. There's old Mrs. Thompson having one of her episodes again, they would say. Charlotte had paved the way for my disappearance for months, spreading rumors about my mental health. All calculated. The third jug of water ran out just as I was about to complete 3 weeks on the island. The food had already run out days before. I survived on some leaves from the garden that I managed to sprout and a few small fish I caught with a makeshift trap, using branches and thread unraveled from my blouse. Hunger was constant, and thirst was becoming unbearable. My lips cracked. My tongue felt like sandpaper. Without my medication, my blood pressure fluctuated dangerously. I could feel the veins in my neck throbbing, my vision sometimes going dark. One particularly hot afternoon, sitting on the porch watching the ranch in the distance, I had a kind of epiphany. Or maybe it was a delusion from dehydration. Who knows? I remembered something I learned from a Korean nurse during the war. Condensation. I took all the pots and containers I could find and spread them out on the porch during the night. In the morning, a thin layer of dew had formed. It wasn't much, but it was water clean, potable water. Just like that, a memory from a war decades ago becomes a lifeline. This is the moment Clara stops being a victim and starts being a survivor. She's found water, but the fight has only just begun. I started collecting this dew daily from every available surface. I survived day after day, drop by drop. On the night of what I think was the 30th day, I was already losing track of time. An unexpected storm hit the lake in the middle of the dry season. I ran around the island, positioning every container I could find to collect the rainwater. Soaked to the bone, I ignored the fear and the cold, focusing only on that unexpected gift. I managed to fill all the jugs and a few more pots. It was like winning the lottery. The storm also brought another gift. Some of the island's vegetation, withered by the drought, had died, providing dry firewood for my signaling attempts. I tried everything to get attention. I wrote a giant SOS with rocks and branches. I made small fires when I saw boats approaching, saving the precious firewood. I created a flag with a bedsheet and a branch. Nothing worked. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months. I lost so much weight that I didn't recognize my reflection in the lake water. My hair, once religiously dyed every week, now showed the natural white of my age. My hands, once soft from applying cream every night, were now calloused from improvising tools with branches and rocks. I survived 1 year, then 2. The makeshift garden grew. I learned to fish better. I developed a more efficient water collection system. The cabin that Charlotte planned as my coffin, I turned into a fortress. Every board, every nail, every object gained a survival function. My body, fragile at first, gained surprising resilience. My blood pressure stabilized naturally. The arthritis hurt less with the constant work. Who would have thought? The attempt to kill me was, in a way, keeping me alive. And on the other side of the lake, I watched my ranch slowly deteriorate in the hands of its new owners. From where I was, with a privileged view, I observed the gradual decay of Hopewell Ranch. The pastures, once immaculate, grew wild. The dairy cows, personally selected by me over the years, were sold and replaced with common cattle. The cheese production, from what I could tell by the decreased movement of trucks, practically ceased. Charlotte and Ethan didn't have the knowledge or the love needed to maintain that legacy. They wanted the value of the land, not the work that came with it. And so, day after day, I documented everything. Not just my survival, but the destruction of what I had built. And there's the irony. They left me for dead, but I stubbornly clung to life. Meanwhile, the legacy they tried to kill me for, they were destroying it themselves, piece by piece, from across the lake. Greed, you see. It ain't ever been a good manager. I used the notebook to the very last page. Then I improvised paper from tree bark, ink from wild berries. I kept a meticulous record, living proof of the betrayal and my resistance. If anyone ever found me, they would have the whole story documented, every detail noted with the precision of a war nurse. The years passed. 5, 7, 10. I, who was supposed to die in days, was still alive while I watched my ranch dying slowly. On each birthday, I made a mark on the cabin wall. 71, 72, until I reached 82. 12 years on that island. 12 years watching life on the other side. Feeling time pass through my increasingly wrinkled but surprisingly strong body. The rescue came from where I least expected it. One morning in 2022, I heard a strange buzzing sound over the island, different from anything I had heard in 12 years there. When I looked up, I saw a drone, one of those little flying devices with a camera that didn't even exist when I was abandoned. The small object hovered over me for a few minutes while I waved frantically. Then it disappeared. I thought it was another dashed hope, but 3 hours later, a boat approached. Inside, a film crew was making a documentary about Lake Oroville. They had seen a mysterious old woman through the drone and came to investigate. I won't lie, when I saw real people after 12 years, I fell to my knees and cried like a child. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. An 82-year-old woman, alone on an artificial island, surviving on minimal resources, talking about a family conspiracy to murder her. It sounded like fiction to them, until I showed them my notes, the survival systems I had created, and especially until they confronted my son and daughter-in-law with my existence. The look on Charlotte's face when she saw me walk onto the ranch, escorted by police officers and the documentary crew, was priceless, white as a sheet, mouth agape in shock. Ethan, my son, collapsed into a chair, caught between horror and disbelief. "But you were supposed to." "How?" he started. "Be dead?" I finished. "Sorry to disappoint you. This old woman is tougher to kill than you imagined." The shock on their faces was palpable, but the documentary crew and the police who had escorted me were already documenting everything. The arrest was immediate. their denials crumbling in the face of my existence. Before I could fully process my return to civilization, the reality of my physical state set in, and I was rushed to the nearest hospital. The effects of 12 years of malnutrition and exposure were my next immediate challenge. As I lay in that sterile hospital room, the fluorescent lights humming above me, the clean sheets feeling alien against my skin, the memories flooded back. Those clean hospital sheets. They felt alien on my skin. The woman lying there wasn't the lady of Hopewell Ranch anymore. That woman, she died out on that island. I was what survived. I was what was forged from mud and lake water and 12 years of silence. And I truly wasn't sure if this civilized world was ready for me, or if I was ready for it. How could I even begin to explain it all? How could they understand the depth of the betrayal, the cruelty of what was done to me by my own blood? To understand how I ended up on that island, you have to understand how I ended up on that property. You have to understand the life I built and the people I loved who tore it all down. My late mother used to say you only understand the present when you know the past. And my past, my friend, has more curves than the Feather River snaking through the Sierra Mountains. I was born in Grass Valley, in the lap of the Californian mountains in 1940, when the world was on fire with the Second World War. My father worked in mining, extracting gold and semi-precious stones, hence my name, Clara May. Two things he loved. My mother was a midwife. She knew every herb in the wilderness, every tea for every ailment. It was from her that I learned my first lessons in caring for others, in healing pain. I grew up among the smell of damp earth, the sound of pans in the mines, and the folk songs in the town square. Everything was very simple, but we didn't know we were poor, we just lived. The turning point in my life came at 17, when I won a scholarship to study nursing in Sacramento. Dad didn't want me to go. A proper woman stays home and has children, he'd say. But Mom, who was always more open-minded, convinced him, if she has the gift of healing like I do, she can't waste it. I was the first in my family to leave Grass Valley to study, carrying a cardboard suitcase with 2 changes of clothes and my mother's little book of medicinal recipes tucked inside. Nursing school was another world, a big building, demanding professors, classmates from the big city who laughed at my country accent. But I was tough, stubborn as a mule. I studied until the candle burned out, memorizing the names of bones, muscles, medicines. I put up with jokes from a chauvinist professor who said a woman's place was giving birth, not assisting in births. I proved my worth during my first emergency room shift, when a construction accident brought in dozens of injured people at once, and not a single hair on my head trembled as I treated open fractures and hemorrhages. I graduated with honors in 1960, but I didn't even have time to work in the States. The world was turning out there, and the Korean War needed volunteer nurses. The UN was recruiting healthcare professionals, and I, moved by that restlessness of a 20-year-old and the desire to see the world, signed up. Dad almost had a fit when he found out. Mom lit candles for every saint on the calendar, but I went with nothing but grit and courage on a military plane crammed with medical supplies and other volunteers as scared as I was. Korea was my hell and my education. I worked in a MASH Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, those field hospitals that moved with the front lines. There were no frills or neat hospital protocols there. It was blood, guts, severed limbs, screams of pain. We operated with the sound of bombs in the background, illuminated by generators that frequently failed. I learned to improvise with what I had on hand, to suture with fishing line, to stop bleeding with whatever was nearby, to extract shrapnel without anesthesia when it ran out. It was there I met Sergeant McCoy, an American from Oklahoma who became my informal survival mentor. When he wasn't tending to the wounded, he taught me tricks, how to purify dirty water, how to find food in hostile places, how to make fire without matches, how to improvise defensive weapons from anything. In a war, nurse, he'd say in his drawl, what separates the living from the dead isn't just luck, it's knowledge. I never imagined that those lessons would be my salvation decades later, on an artificial island in the middle of Lake Oroville. She's right, she couldn't have imagined it. All that knowledge, forged in the fire of a global conflict, was meant to save other lives. She had no way of knowing she was really training to save her own from a betrayal much closer to home. Keep listening as we find out how this war nurse builds a new life and who will eventually tear it all down. I returned to the States in '63, after 3 years of pure horror and learning. I brought back nightmares that woke me up sweating at night, but also a strength I never knew I had. I worked for a while in Sacramento, but the United States was also simmering. The civil rights movement was in full swing. Things were tense. In '65, an opportunity arose to work at the newly opened UC Davis Medical Center. The area was growing. It needed qualified health professionals and paid well. I packed my bag, now a leather one bought with my own money, and headed for the Central Valley. Sacramento was a sprawling construction site, red dust everywhere, half-finished buildings, and the bluest sky I'd ever seen. I moved into a rented room in Midtown and took the crowded bus to the hospital. The work was demanding, the city was growing faster than its infrastructure. Everything was in short supply. But there was an energy in that place, a sense that we were building something new, important. On weekends, when I had time off, I explored the area with colleagues from the hospital. It was on one of those outings, a picnic near Folsom Lake, that my life changed again. Henry Thompson appeared, riding a handsome bay horse, like in the romance novels I used to read in secret as a girl. Tall, sun-tanned skin, honey-colored eyes. He was looking for a stray heifer from his herd and stopped to ask if we had seen the animal. He ended up sitting down to have coffee with us, listening to our city stories. He was from another world, a traditional rancher, from an old family in the region, who lived in what is now the outskirts of Sacramento, long before the city boomed. He looked at me with curiosity, this Californian nurse full of war stories. When he left, he didn't ask for my number or anything. I thought I'd never see him again. 3 days later, he showed up at the hospital entrance with a bouquet of wildflowers and a shy smile. "I heard you're the best nurse here," he said awkwardly. "I have a ranch hand who cut his hand on barbed wire. It's getting infected. Could you take a look?" It was a pretext, of course. The ranch hand existed, and so did the cut, but he could have gone to any clinic. I treated the wound and accepted his invitation to visit his ranch the following Sunday. Hopewell Ranch was a piece of paradise. 600 acres of good land, crossed by springs, with green pastures even in the dry season. The main house was a California mission-style home. Henry had brought the architecture of his heritage, a clay tile roof, thick adobe walls, blue-trimmed windows, a wide porch with a hammock. Around it, an orchard with every kind of fruit, a generous vegetable garden, a bustling chicken coop, and in the background, the jewel in the crown, the creamery, where he produced artisanal cheeses following family recipes. The courtship was quick and intense. At 32, I was no longer a young girl by the standards of the time, and he, at 40, was considered an uncatchable bachelor by his friends. Within 6 months, I was married and moving my things into the room that would be ours. I left the medical center. Henry wanted me to stay on the ranch, but I put my foot down. I opened a small clinic on the property to serve the employees and neighbors. On weekends, I started poking my nose into the creamery, curious about the cheese production. Henry was a good man, the type who didn't make a big fuss but was always there. He wasn't one for grand displays of affection in public, but he would bring me a wildflower every day when he came back from his work. He respected my work, my independent ways, my stories from Korea, which sometimes scared him a little. "You're different from any woman I've ever known, Clara," he would say, half in awe, half confused by this wife who knew how to stop bleeding and shoot if she had to. A year after we married, Ethan came along, our only son. It was a difficult pregnancy. I wasn't young anymore, I had preeclampsia, and I was on bed rest for the last 2 months. The birth was complicated, lasting over 24 hours, but when I finally held that boy in my arms, I knew it was all worth it. Henry cried like a baby. He, who never shed a tear. "He's the first Thompson born in Sacramento," he would say proudly to anyone who would listen. Ethan grew up free and happy, between the fields of the ranch and the hustle and bustle of the capital, which was getting bigger and bigger. He went to a good school in the suburbs. He would come home with his head buzzing with ideas. He was smart, curious, determined. He took after me in that, but he also had a trait from his father, a certain naivety. He trusted people too easily. This combination, which we found so charming, would end up being his and my downfall. The years went by. The ranch prospered. I became more and more involved in cheese production, applying my technical knowledge of hygiene and handling. I created cleaning protocols, improved the aging process. When Henry realized I had a knack for it, he gave me free rein to experiment. Together, we developed the artisanal Monterey Jack with wild herbs, which won our first award in '78. Ethan went to college to study business administration. He was supposed to come back and help expand the family business. That's where he met Charlotte at a freshman party. When he brought her to the ranch, I confess I didn't take to her at first. A big city girl, acting all sophisticated, looking at everything on the ranch with a little smirk of superiority. But I swallowed my dislike. Your children choose with their hearts, not with their mother's head. And she seemed to like my boy so much, so dedicated, so attentive to him. Charlotte was the only daughter of a civil engineer and a dentist, raised with the best of everything in Sacramento. She was studying architecture, had these modern ideas about sustainable spaces, projects, and whatnot. She spoke in complicated terms, quoted important people, had ambitious plans. Ethan was mesmerized, captivated by this world so different from ours. "She's brilliant, Mom," he would say. "She's going to revolutionize American architecture." And who was I to doubt it? They got married in 2000, a big party at the ranch. Henry spared no expense. He was their only son. He deserved the best. Charlotte wore a very expensive dress, a fancy imported car, decorations, catering from San Francisco. I remember my old man looking at the bills afterward, scratching his head, worried but happy for his son. "It's only money, Clara," he'd say. "The important thing is the boy's happiness." For the first few years of their marriage, they lived in Sacramento. Ethan worked for a major tech firm. He had given up the idea of returning to the ranch. Charlotte started her own architecture firm, specializing in innovative, sustainable projects, her words. They would visit us on holidays and some weekends. But you could feel that the rural world was no longer my son's priority. Henry hid his disappointment, but I knew that worried wrinkle on his forehead well. It was in 2005 that our world fell apart. Henry had a massive stroke while tending to the cattle. They found him collapsed near the corral, already gone. We buried him in the small family cemetery at the back of the ranch, where 3 generations of Thompsons rested. For the first time since I set foot in Korea, I felt completely lost. 35 years together, and suddenly, only the silence of widowhood. Ethan and Charlotte came to the ranch after the funeral. They spent a week with me. We talked about the future, about what to do with it all. By then, the ranch had become a benchmark for artisanal cheeses. We sold to fine restaurants all over the country. We had 30 employees, a select herd, a recognized brand. "I'll take over, Mom," Ethan said. "I'll honor Dad's legacy." To my surprise, they really did move to the ranch 3 months later. Ethan quit his job at the tech firm. Charlotte kept her office but said she would work from home, traveling to Sacramento when necessary. At first, I was relieved. I really didn't want to run that place alone. Not at my age, not without Henry. I started stepping back from the administration, leaving everything in my son's hands, focusing only on the creamery, which was my passion. The first signs that something was wrong started subtly. I noticed Charlotte making long phone calls at night, speaking in a low voice. When I approached, she would hang up. Once I caught snippets of the conversation. "Worth much more. Prime location. Just wait a little longer." I mentioned it to Ethan, who just shrugged. "It's her work, Mom. She's negotiating a big project." I swallowed my concerns and pretended to believe him. Then came the technical visits. People in suits with briefcases whom she would show around the property. Potential clients. She would explain vaguely. But I wasn't a fool. Those people didn't look like they wanted to hire an architect. They looked like people assessing land, real estate speculators, property brokers. Again, Ethan would brush it off when I brought it up. "Let Charlotte work, Mom. She knows what she's doing." One afternoon in 2008, I overheard a conversation between them on the porch. I was bringing them coffee. I stopped behind the door when I heard my name. "Your mother will never agree, Ethan," Charlotte was saying. "She's too attached to this place. But just think, we could sell it for at least $15 million, buy a luxury condo in Los Angeles, travel the world, live off the interest. Why kill ourselves working in this backwater?" The silence that followed chilled me to the bone. My son didn't answer, didn't defend the ranch, didn't say that it was his father's legacy, his father's life's work. I only heard a tired sigh. "We can't sell it while she's alive, Charlotte. You know that." Her response was what scared me the most. What if she weren't? I walked away without making a sound. My heart was pounding, the coffee tray shaking in my hands. That night, I locked my bedroom door for the first time since I moved to the ranch. I started paying more attention, watching their every move, especially hers. I began keeping copies of important documents in a false bottom of a drawer. Deeds, certificates, contracts. If they wanted to cheat me, it wouldn't be easy. It was around this time that Charlotte started getting closer to me. Suddenly, she became the attentive daughter-in-law, interested in my stories, curious about my past. At first, I was suspicious. It was too sudden a change, but I confess I slowly let my guard down. I so wanted to believe I was wrong, that I had misunderstood that conversation, that my son and my daughter-in-law weren't planning to get rid of me to take the ranch. So I gave in, shared, opened up. In one of those intimate conversations, I told her about my water phobia. I told her about the day I almost drowned in the Yuba River at age 7. I had gone with older cousins. They jumped into a deep part. I followed without knowing how to swim. I sank like a stone, swallowed water, saw death up close. An uncle saved me at the last second, but the trauma remained. Since then, I would panic just seeing water deeper than a bathtub. "That's why I never go into the lake when you guys do," I explained. "Not even in a deep pool. The panic paralyzes me." Charlotte's eyes sparkled in a strange way when I told her this. I didn't notice it at the time, but she had just gained a valuable piece of information, a weakness she could exploit. In the following months, she started talking a lot about facing fears, about how liberating it would be for me to overcome this phobia. She insisted I try getting into the shallow end of the ranch's pool. "Just a little bit, mother-in-law, with us holding you." I refused every time. The terror was too real. In 2009, Ethan started showing signs that something was wrong. He lost weight, had dark circles under his eyes. His mood was unstable. When I asked, he brushed it off. But the older ranch hands, who were loyal to me, told me he was gambling poker, horse races, any bet. It had started as fun with friends in Sacramento. It turned into a serious addiction. He owed money to a loan shark. He had pawned his car, withdrawn savings without telling me. And Charlotte, she knew everything, of course. Not only knew, but used it. "If we don't solve this situation soon, we're going to lose everything, Ethan," I heard her say one night when they thought I was already asleep. "Vince won't wait much longer. Either we pay the $150,000 or he's coming after you. We have to speed up the plan." What plan could that be? At the time, I had no idea of the scale of the horror being plotted. It was in January 2010 that the bomb dropped. Ethan came to me, trembling, to tell me he had sold 75 acres of the ranch without my knowledge, forging my signature. "It was either that or they'd kill me. Mom," he cried like a child. "I owe a lot of money to the wrong kind of people." For the first time in my life, I raised my hand to my son. The slap echoed in the empty kitchen. "Your father would be turning in his grave if he knew," I screamed. "How could you? How?" Charlotte walked in at that moment, saw me upset, saw her son crying, and played the role of the peacemaker, the sensible one. "We'll sort this out, Mrs. Thompson. Ethan made a mistake, but it can be fixed. The important thing is that nobody gets hurt." She hugged me, calmed me down, made me tea. And while I sobbed with rage and disappointment, she was working out the next step of her macabre plan. That's when the idea of the birthday surprise came up. It was 3 months before my 70th birthday. "I want to give you something special, unique," Charlotte said one morning, all excited. something only an architect could create. She spoke of an exclusive, secret project that would be revealed on the day. Ethan, now recovered from the scandal of the land sale, seemed excited too. "You'll love it, Mom. It's so Charlotte, full of different ideas." For weeks, I saw trucks coming and going from the ranch, always using the access road farthest from the main house. I heard construction noises. At night, when I asked, they would both evade the question with knowing smiles. "A surprise is a surprise, Mrs. Thompson." I confess that, despite everything, I let myself get carried away by the anticipation. I so wanted to believe they had changed, that they cared, that they valued me. On the eve of my birthday, in April 2010, Charlotte came to me, all excited, showing me photos of a beautiful wooden cabin, lovingly decorated. "It's your gift, a retreat just for you, to rest, read, enjoy nature." She showed me details. The porch with a hammock, the small equipped kitchen, the cozy bedroom with a handmade quilt. It seemed perfect, except for one detail. "Where is this paradise?" "I'll show you in person tomorrow," she said with that smile that never reached her eyes. "It's nearby, but it's a complete surprise." That night, I couldn't sleep well. Something was bothering me, a bad feeling, that intuition of someone who has seen a lot of evil in their life. But I pushed the thought away. It was my 70th birthday. I deserved to celebrate. I deserved to believe in the best. The next morning, Ethan and Charlotte woke me up with breakfast in bed, flowers, a simple gift, a wool shawl, a book of poetry I wanted. "The real gift is after lunch," they said. Close friends came, old ranch hands. We had a simple barbecue. Everyone seemed to know about the surprise. They exchanged glances, restrained smiles. After dessert, cornbread muffins, my favorite, Charlotte took me by the hand. "It's time, mother-in-law. We're taking you to your special retreat." We drove down a secondary road on the ranch to the point where the property bordered Lake Oroville. There, tied to a small pier, was a simple wooden boat. My heart froze. Where's the cabin?" I asked, feeling my throat tighten. Charlotte pointed to the middle of the lake. About 200 yards from the shore, I saw a perfect little island, a green circle with a wooden structure in the center. "There, your own piece of paradise, Mrs. Thompson. An artificial island, just for you, a private paradise." But as Clara would soon learn, some gifts are traps in disguise. The chill she felt wasn't just from the lake, it was a warning. Stay with us to hear the moment she realizes she's been trapped. I must have turned as white as a sheet. An island. In the middle of the water. "But you know that She interrupted me, her voice strangely rehearsed. "We know about your phobia, Mom. That's exactly why. The doctor said facing your fears is the best therapy. You don't have to stay there if you don't want to. It's just to see it. We'll be with you the whole time." There were other people there, some ranch hands, 2 or 3 friends. They all seemed to think it was normal, an eccentric but affectionate gift. No one noticed the terror in my eyes, the trembling in my hands, or they pretended not to. Today, I wonder if some of them weren't in on it, paid off perhaps, or just plain blind. "I can't," I whispered. "You know I can't." Charlotte put her arm around my shoulder. "You're just going to see it, Mrs. Thompson. I spent so much time planning it, hired the best environmental engineers. It's a work of art, totally sustainable. If you don't like it, we'll come back right away, I promise." Social pressure, the embarrassment of refusing in front of everyone, the desire not to disappoint, the fear of seeming weak. I gave in. With shaky legs, I got into that boat. Ethan rowed. Charlotte chattered on about the wonders of the island, how hard it was to build, how it would be my special corner. I barely heard her, focusing on breathing, on not fainting from panic. The island was truly beautiful, I can't deny it. A perfect circle of about 3,000 square feet, with a lawn, small trees, flower beds. In the center, the cabin from the photos, even more beautiful in person. A generous porch surrounded the entire structure with chairs, a hammock, potted plants. It looked like a little piece of paradise, if it weren't for the fact that it was surrounded by water on all sides. Ethan helped me disembark, practically carrying me because my legs wouldn't respond properly. "See, Mom? Isn't it beautiful?" I nodded, unable to speak. Charlotte opened the cabin door with a golden key, which she handed to me ceremoniously. "All yours, mother-in-law. Your own world." Inside, the cabin was a dream. A small but cozy living room with a sofa, coffee tables, shelves with books. A compact and functional kitchen, fully equipped. A small bedroom with a double bed, a patchwork quilt, pictures on the walls. A clean bathroom with a shower, porcelain sink, soft towels. In the cupboards, basic groceries, fresh fruit, coffee, tea, cookies. On the bookshelf, the book I had been reading the previous week, marked at the exact page where I had stopped. "It has everything you need to relax," Charlotte explained, opening cupboards, showing details. "We left your blood pressure medicine in the nightstand drawer. There's even that cream you like to put on your hands before bed. Every detail was thought out, every care meticulous. Now I know it was to avoid suspicion, to seem genuine. At the time, I confess I was touched. I even momentarily forgot my panic about the water. We had a snack on the porch, coffee, cheese, and crackers they had brought in a cooler. Homemade fig jam from the ranch. Ethan seemed nervous, checking his watch constantly. Charlotte talked non-stop, pointing out details of the island, explaining how it had been built. A floating structure anchored to the bottom of the lake, completely stable and safe. After an hour, Ethan stood up abruptly. "We have to go, Mom. I have that meeting with the distributor from Reading, remember?" I didn't remember any meeting, but I nodded, relieved. Finally, we were leaving this place that, despite its beauty, made me feel deeply uneasy. "But you can stay if you want," Charlotte added, a little too casually. "Enjoy the afternoon. Watch the sunset from here. It's spectacular. We'll be back before dark to pick you up." I froze again. "Stay here alone? Surrounded by water?" No, I'll go with you now." That's when Ethan dropped the bomb. "Mom, actually, we have another surprise waiting on the shore. More guests for your party. We need to get everything ready." Charlotte completed the thought. "You rest here for a bit, and we'll be back in 2 hours with everything ready for the big celebration." Before I could protest, they were already heading for the boat. "Just 2 little hours, Mom, I promise," Ethan shouted, already getting in. "We left everything you need there. Just relax." Charlotte smiled and waved as they moved away. I stood paralyzed on the porch, watching the boat shrink in the distance, a knot of anguish growing in my chest. 2 hours passed, then 3. When the sun began to set, I was sure they wouldn't be back. The realization hit me with the weight of an anvil. Everything had been meticulously planned. The cabin stocked for a few days, the island far enough that no one would hear me scream, all surrounded by water I couldn't cross even if I wanted to. The first few days on that island were a true test of my sanity. The water all around seemed to suffocate me, even though I was on solid ground. Every little sound of the waves hitting the edge was like a hammer on my head. I could handle it during the day, but at night, my goodness, the night was hell. I couldn't sleep. I would huddle in bed, breaking out in a cold sweat, my heart trying to leap out of my chest. I had panic attacks like I'd never experienced before. I couldn't breathe. My vision would go dark. My legs would tremble. Once, I fell to my knees on the porch floor, thinking I was going to die right there, alone, abandoned. But you know what's worse than fear? Humiliation. To be deceived like that, betrayed by your own, thrown away like a squeezed orange. That hurt more than any panic. In moments of despair, it was anger that brought me back, that made me take a deep breath and think, I'm not going to give them the satisfaction. I'm not going to die here. And it was that anger, mixed with that Californian stubbornness I inherited from my father, that got me through the first month. On the 3rd day, when it became clear that no one was coming for me, I did a full inventory of the cabin. I needed to know exactly what I could count on. In the kitchen, rice, beans, pasta, various canned goods, sugar, salt, coffee, tea, flour, oil enough for about 3 weeks if I rationed well. Fresh fruit that would last a week at most. 6 bottles of mineral water. In the bathroom, toilet paper, soap, shampoo, my hand cream, sanitary pads, a macabre detail. They even thought of that. In the bedroom, light summer clothes, 2 thin blankets, a notebook, and 3 pencils. Other useful things I found scattered around. A small toolbox with a hammer, nails, a screwdriver, and pliers. A flashlight with batteries. A box of matches. 3 candles. A Swiss Army knife, sewing thread and needles. A pair of scissors. Various plastic containers. Some old magazines. A deck of cards. I made a meticulous list in the notebook, noting every item, no matter how small. It would be my survival map. I also found my blood pressure medication only 20 pills. Taking 1 a day, they would last less than 3 weeks. What Charlotte had planned was obvious. An elderly, hypertensive woman, without medication, under extreme stress, death by natural causes, leaving no trace. In the beginning, it was all about willpower. I forced myself to eat, even with no appetite. I rationed the mineral water, half a glass in the morning, half in the afternoon, half at night. I did activities to maintain my sanity. I cleaned the cabin, watched the birds, and wrote in the notebook. At night, when the fear was strongest, I told stories out loud. Gold Rush legends my mother used to tell, stories from Korea, memories of the ranch. It was pathetic, an old woman talking to herself in the dark, but it worked. The sound of my own voice chased away the terrifying silence. On the 5th day, I began my plan to signal for help. I took white bedsheets and spread them on the lawn, forming the letters SOS. I waved frantically with a red towel whenever I saw boats in the distance, but they never came close enough. Lake Oroville is huge, and that island was in a somewhat hidden cove, off the main recreational routes perfect for their plan. I tried making smoke with damp leaves, as I had learned in Korea, but without enough wood, it was hard to keep the fire going, and I needed to save the matches. I only had 1 box. I thought about trying to light bonfires at night, but I was afraid of attracting wild animals. Yes, I had that fear too. Snakes, scorpions, mountain lions, maybe. The California wilderness is full of creatures, and that island was very close to preserved forest areas. On the 7th day, the bottled water ran out. That's when I really started applying what I learned in the field hospitals in Korea. I took all the pots and buckets I could find and spread them around the island to collect rainwater. But we were in the middle of the California dry season. The rains wouldn't come for months. I had to resort to more desperate techniques. I dug a hole, lined it with a plastic trash bag, placed a mug in the center, and covered it with another plastic sheet. The sun would heat it, the moisture from the soil would condense on the plastic and drip into the mug. It yielded about a cup a day. It was barely enough to quench my thirst, but it was better than nothing. I also learned to purify the lake water. I took the oven rack and placed it over rocks. I built a fire underneath and boiled the water in pots. I let it settle with a bit of charcoal from the fire, which acted as a makeshift filter. The taste was horrible, brackish, with a hint of sludge. But after boiling and settling, at least it didn't give me diarrhea. I drank it, making faces, thinking of all the damn germs that could be in there, but I had no choice. It was that or dehydrate. The blood pressure medication ran out as I predicted, in less than 3 weeks. I started to feel the symptoms of uncontrolled hypertension. Constant headaches, blurred vision, ringing in my ears. That's when I turned to herbs. In the war, I worked with a Korean nurse who knew medicinal plants. I started exploring the island's vegetation, testing leaves, roots, looking for something that could help. I found an herb similar to lemongrass that helped to calm me. It didn't replace the medicine, of course, but it provided temporary relief. Food was another huge challenge. The kitchen supplies lasted 3 weeks, even with severe rationing. When they ran out, I had to get creative. I used the Swiss Army knife and pieces of wire from the garden fence to make makeshift fish hooks. The sewing thread became fishing line. It wasn't very strong, but it could handle sunfish and other smaller fish from the lake. I brought them in one by one, patiently. Each little fish was a huge victory. I also created bird traps using shoe boxes, twigs, and leftover food as bait. I mostly caught doves and jays that were attracted to the wild berries on the island. It wasn't easy. I had never been a hunter, and killing those little creatures broke my heart. But between starving to death and killing a bird to eat, I had no doubt. I cleaned the birds as I had seen Henry do on the ranch. I used every little piece, even the bones, to make broth. One of the most valuable resources was the small garden Charlotte had planted as decoration. It had lettuce, cherry tomatoes, green onions, cilantro. It didn't last long, but it gave me the idea to expand it. I started planting the seeds from the fruits they had left: melon, tomato, bell pepper. I even planted lemon and orange pits, even though I knew it would take years for them to bear fruit. It was more for hope than for practicality. I improvised gardening tools with silverware and pieces of wood. I dug deeper in search of good soil. I fertilized with food scraps and bird droppings. I collected earthworms at night when they came to the surface. It was constant, meticulous work that required patience I never knew I had. Every little sprout that appeared was celebrated as a personal victory. The hardest part was dealing with the loneliness, not the loneliness of someone who lives alone. I already knew that since Henry died. It was a deeper loneliness, of someone who has been abandoned, thrown away. Sometimes I would find myself talking to the birds, to the plants, even to inanimate objects. I gave names to the tools. The hammer was Henry. The pliers were Joe. The kitchen knife was Miss Mary. Crazy, right? But it kept my mind busy. To not completely lose track of time, I made a calendar on the cabin wall. Each mark was a day. I grouped them in sets of 7. Each set was a week. 4 sets, a month. That's how I realized when my birthday came around again. 71 years old, alone on an artificial island, eating raw fish because the matches had run out. Watching the ranch from a distance became almost an obsession. From the highest point of the island, using the lens of a small pair of binoculars I found in a drawer, probably left there by chance, I could see the activity at the main house. I saw my son and daughter-in-law coming and going, visitors' cars, delivery trucks. For the first few months, they seemed to maintain a normal routine. Then the changes began. I saw when they sold the first part of the herd, the prize-winning cows that Henry and I had genetically selected over decades, about 60 head leaving in cattle trucks. Then it was the creamery equipment, dismantled and taken away in moving trucks. The cheese production, from what I could observe, dwindled until it stopped completely. I documented everything meticulously in my notebook: dates, times, detailed descriptions. If I ever managed to get out of there, I would have proof of the gradual dismantling of the ranch. When the notebook ran out, I started using the blank pages of magazines, then the margins of the texts, then any scrap of paper I could find. When the paper ran out, I used pieces of wood, large dried leaves, even flat stones to write on with charcoal. The months passed, and with them, the seasons. The California summer is merciless. The heat on the island was suffocating, with no large trees for shade. I improvised hats with wild banana leaves, wet my clothes to cool down. The winter brought a biting cold at night, worsened by the humidity from the lake. The thin blankets were barely enough. I slept huddled, wearing all available clothes, sometimes with a small fire lit near the bed, always being very careful not to set the cabin on fire. The rainwater collection system improved over time. When the rainy season finally arrived, I was prepared with all possible containers spread out strategically. I created makeshift gutters with bamboo, directing the water from the roof into barrels. I boiled everything to be safe. Even so, I got dysentery a few times. Without proper medicine, I treated it with teas made from leaves I discovered had anti-diarrheal properties. My daily routine became almost mechanical. Wake up with the sun, check fish and bird traps, tend to the garden, collect water, prepare food, watch the ranch, maintain the cabin, set more traps, collect firewood, make a fire before dark, eat dinner, write in whatever I was using as a diary, sleep. Day after day, week after week, my body adapted. My mind, not always. There were days when lucidity escaped me. I would talk to Henry as if he were there. I would tell stories to a child, Ethan, who no longer existed. In those moments, I forced myself to do exhausting physical tasks, weeding the garden until my arms ached, carrying rocks from one side of the island to the other, anything to anchor me in reality. The heavy physical labor brought terrible pain to my old bones, but it kept my sanity intact. The storm that almost finished me came at the end of the first year. One of those California summer thunderstorms, violent, with fierce winds and lightning that cut through the sky like knives. The lake turned into an enraged monster with waves I had never seen before. The island, being artificial and relatively new, began to give way at some edges. I saw pieces of land being washed away by the water, the structure trembling. The cabin swayed with the wind, leaks popping up everywhere. A part of the roof was completely torn off, flooding the bedroom. I tried to save what I could: food, tools, seeds from the garden. I barricaded myself in the bathroom, the most internal and protected room, huddled among buckets and pans that were quickly filling with rainwater. It was the longest night of my life, worse even than the bombings in Korea. There, at least, I was surrounded by other human beings, by comrades in the trenches. Here, it was just me and the fury of nature. I prayed every prayer I could remember. I promised all sorts of offerings if I survived. I cried until I had no tears left. At some point, exhausted, I ended up falling asleep, huddled on the wet floor. I woke up with the sun on my face through the hole in the roof. The storm had passed, leaving destruction in its wake. Half the garden was underwater. Several of my water collection systems had been blown away by the wind. The island's structure had visibly shrunk, but the cabin, surprisingly, was still standing, though badly damaged. And I was alive. I spent the following weeks repairing what I could. I collected pieces of wood brought by the storm to reinforce the roof. I replanted what was left of the garden, rebuilt traps. It was a fresh start, but in a way, that destruction ended up bringing new resources: logs, branches, plants, even some objects that the wind or water had brought from other parts of the lake. Among the gifts from the storm, I found a plastic box with a lid that had floated to the island. Inside, miraculously dry, was a basic first aid kit, probably from some pleasure boat: gauze, bandages, a small bottle of alcohol, painkillers. I cried when I saw those simple pills, something anyone could buy at a drugstore without a second thought. To me, they were more precious than diamonds. I guarded them like treasure, using them only in absolute emergencies. It was after the storm that I started to dream regularly of rescue. Before, it was a vague idea, a distant hope. Then it became a concrete project. I intensified my signals, using the new materials to create more visible structures. I made a larger flag with colorful fabrics. I collected shells and shiny rocks to form SOS signals that could be seen from above. I also started testing escape ideas. I tried to build a raft with tied logs, but without proper ropes. The most I could manage was an unstable structure that sank with my weight. I thought about swimming, but besides the paralyzing phobia, the distance was too great for an old woman, even one in good physical shape, as I was becoming. My body had adapted to that wild life in surprising ways. My arms were strong from digging and carrying. My legs were firm. My endurance had increased. Watching the ranch from a distance, I noticed even more drastic changes in the second year. The main house, once impeccably maintained, began to show signs of neglect. Broken windows weren't fixed. The garden I had cultivated with such care became overgrown. The fields that should have been plowed seasonally were abandoned. Fewer employees were around. More moving trucks arrived and left, loaded. They were dismantling everything bit by bit, selling what they could, abandoning what had no immediate value. Hopewell Ranch, the dream of generations of Thompsons, the legacy Henry loved so much, was dying before my eyes. This is the ultimate, cruel irony. Clara is forced to watch, helpless, as the very legacy she was meant to die for is being auctioned off piece by piece. They tried to kill her for the ranch, and now their own greed is killing the ranch itself. But with every piece they sell, Clara's anger is hardening into resolve, and she's documenting everything. And I, helpless, could only watch and document. Every note I made was driven not just by the need to keep records, but by a cold, calculating anger that grew every day. In the third year of isolation, something interesting happened. I stopped being afraid of the water. It wasn't a miraculous cure for my phobia. It was more like a forced acceptance. When you live surrounded by your greatest fear for so long, there comes a time when it just becomes part of the landscape. I started getting closer to the edge of the island, dipping my feet in the lake, using the water not just out of necessity, but almost with a reluctant intimacy. I built a sort of makeshift dock with logs and branches where I could sit and fish more easily. I washed clothes there, watched the movement of the water. Sometimes I would spend hours just looking at the sun's reflections on the surface, the fish swimming, the dragonflies landing momentarily. The lake, which was my prison, also became my only constant companion. Food continued to be a daily challenge. I learned to identify native edible plants of the region that grew on the island. Manzanita berries, wild plums, acorns. I created a harvesting calendar based on the seasons. The garden had expanded and diversified. Besides the basic vegetables, I grew cassava, which I discovered grew well in that soil, sweet potatoes, okra. The fruit seeds had sprouted, and although they were still small seedlings, they gave hope for a future harvest. My body changed completely in those years. The hair I used to dye regularly was completely white and had grown down to my waist. I would cut it with the rusty scissors when it became unmanageable. My once well-cared-for skin was now weathered by the sun, full of new spots, calloused by constant work. I lost so much weight that I didn't recognize my reflection in the lake water. My bones protruded, veins popped out on my arms and hands. But surprisingly, I was strong, physically stronger than I had ever been, even in my youth. Sicknesses came and went. I had unexplained fevers that I treated with water compresses and herbal teas. A foot infection, after a cut from a shell, almost turned into gangrene. I saved the limb with herbal poultices and obsessive washings with boiled water. Joint pain, especially on damp days, I relieved with compresses of leaves I discovered had an anti-inflammatory effect. The high blood pressure, surprisingly, stabilized with the forcibly natural diet and constant physical labor. What affected me the most, however, were dental problems. Without a proper toothbrush, toothpaste, or dental floss, I improvised with twigs chewed at the end and vegetable fibers. I lost 2 teeth in the 3rd year. The pain was unbearable. I treated it with wild cloves chewed directly on the spot. A trick I learned from a Filipino nurse in Korea. It worked for the pain, but the teeth were gone anyway. The winters were particularly difficult. In the 3rd year, I modified the cabin's interior to retain more heat. I sealed cracks with mud and leaves. I created a sort of thermal mat with dry straw and overlapping large leaves. Even so, the nights were teeth-chattering cold. I slept wrapped in all available clothes, with rocks heated by the fire, wrapped in cloth, at my feet. It was in the 4th winter that I noticed an even more radical change at the ranch. Through the binoculars, I saw large trucks arriving, crews with yellow hard hats, earth-moving machinery. They were building something new where the main pastures used to be. From the activity, it looked like something big, a housing development perhaps, or a resort. It was hard to be sure from a distance. But one thing was clear. Hopewell Ranch, as I knew it, no longer existed. During the same period, I noticed more activity on the lake. Pleasure boats passed more frequently, some even relatively close to the island. I intensified my signaling efforts. I waved frantically with colorful cloths. I tried to reflect the sunlight with pieces of metal from the toolbox. No one seemed to notice. It was as if I were invisible, or as if that island was so normal in the landscape that no one questioned the presence of an old woman there. 12 years. Folks tend to see only what they expect to see. They saw a private island, some rich person's oddball eco-project. They didn't see a prison cell. The truth can be sitting right in plain sight, but most people are just too busy to stop and really look. It was around this time that I developed a more efficient smoke signal system. I had accumulated enough fuel, dry wood, leaves, tree resin, and I would create small fires that produced dense smoke when I saw boats approaching. A few times, I noticed boats slightly changing course, as if they had seen something, but they never got really close. Did they think it was just someone having a barbecue on a private island? Or had Charlotte and Ethan spread some story about the place to keep curious people away? By the 5th year, my routine was so established that I almost forgot, for moments, that this wasn't my normal life. I woke up with the sun, checked traps and the garden, prepared food, took care of the cabin and water systems, watched the ranch, documented everything, prepared for the night, slept. The days blended into one another, marked only by the seasons and the gradual changes in the surrounding landscape. Loneliness remained the cruelest challenge. To maintain my sanity, I developed elaborate rituals. I celebrated birthdays mine, Henry's, even Ethan's, despite him being responsible for my situation. I sang to myself on full moon nights. I told stories out loud to the garden plants while watering them. I gave names to the birds that regularly visited the island. I had a California scrub jay I called Hank, like the hammer, and a pair of mourning doves who were Joe and Mary. My perception of time changed completely. I no longer counted in hours or days, but in natural cycles. How long until the next rain, when a certain plant would bear fruit, how the sun's position gradually changed, indicating the passing of the seasons. Time stretched and contracted in strange ways. Sometimes, whole weeks would pass in the blink of an eye. Other times, a single afternoon of a storm seemed to last an eternity. The hope of rescue, which was constant at first, became something more complex. I still created and maintained signals, still tried to attract the attention of passing boats, but I began to accept the possibility that I might live the rest of my days on that island. It wasn't a defeatist acceptance, but a pragmatic one. If this was my destiny, I would live it as best as I could, making the most of the situation. It was this change in mindset that allowed me to survive beyond what anyone, especially Charlotte, could have predicted. I wasn't just surviving, desperately waiting for rescue. I was living, adapting, finding small pleasures and purposes in each day. The sunrise seen from the porch, the sweet taste of a freshly picked fruit, the satisfaction of seeing a seed I planted turn into a productive plant, the simple joy of swimming. Yes, eventually I overcame the fear enough for short dips near the edge on hot summer days. In the 7th year, something unusual happened. During a particularly strong storm, a small boat capsized not far from the island. I saw it all happen. The boat being overturned by an abnormally large wave, 3 people in the water. 2 managed to swim to the distant shore, but the 3rd was struggling, flailing, clearly without the strength to reach land. In that moment, something strange happened to me. The fear of water, which had already diminished but was still there, simply vanished. Without a second thought, I jumped into the lake and swam to the drowning man. He was an older gentleman than me, maybe 80 years old, in complete panic. Using rescue techniques I had learned decades ago, I managed to stabilize him and bring him to the island. He was in shock, coughing up water, shivering from cold and fear. I took him to the cabin, dried him with the few clean cloths I had, gave him hot tea. When he could finally speak, his first words were, "Who are you? What is this place?" I told him my story in brief. He listened with wide eyes, clearly thinking I was crazy or delirious. He said his name was Walter. He was a retired professor out with his sons when the storm hit. He promised to send help as soon as he was rescued. The next day, when the weather improved, we saw a sheriff's department boat approaching. His sons had called the authorities. My heart pounded with hope. Finally, after 7 years, I would be rescued. I waved frantically along with Walter. The boat approached. The officers helped Walter aboard. I started gathering my few possessions, ready to go too, but then I heard the conversation. Walter explaining that he had found this confused lady living alone on the island. One of the officers replying, "Oh yes, Mrs. Thompson. The family has already informed us about her. She has dementia. Thinks she was abandoned here. It's actually the family's private property. They look after her from a distance. Don't worry, I was paralyzed with shock. They didn't believe me." Charlotte and Ethan had thought of everything, even creating a cover story in case I was found. I tried to protest, to show my diaries, the evidence I had collected, but the officers were kind and firm. "We'll inform your family that you're all right, Mrs. Thompson. They get worried when you have these episodes." And they left, taking Walter, who looked back with a confused expression, leaving me once again alone on the island. Can you imagine the cruelty of that moment? 7 years of waiting, and hope is snatched away by the very lie that imprisoned her. This is the moment that could have broken anyone. Let's find out what Clara does now, that her only hope has been extinguished. Seems ridiculous, doesn't it? I thought so too. A woman, skin and bones, living like a wild animal, begging for help, and they just believed the story from the folks back on shore? Charlotte had done her homework. She'd been poisoning the well for months, painting me as the crazy old lady long before she ever built that island. Sometimes a well-told lie is just more powerful than the truth staring you right in the face. That day almost broke my spirit completely. The hope of rescue had been so close, so tangible, and then snatched away so cruelly. I spent days in a near catatonic state, barely able to get out of bed for basic needs. But something curious happened about a week later. A small boat approached the island, not an official one, just a small fishing boat. In it, Walter came alone, carrying a bag with supplies, food, basic medicines, a thermos of hot coffee. "They didn't believe me when I told them your story," he said. "They said you have mental issues, that this abandonment story is a delusion. But I believed you. It was the first real conversation with another human being in 7 years. I cried so much I could barely speak. Walter couldn't take me away. He would be accused of kidnapping since I was officially under my family's care. But he promised to return regularly with supplies and, most importantly, he believed me. He kept his promise for a few months. He came every 2 weeks, always in the fishing boat, always alone, always bringing what he could without raising suspicion. It was a lifeline for my sanity. To be able to talk, share stories, get news from the outside world was like water in the desert for my parched soul. But then, after 6 months of these precious visits, Walter didn't show up on the scheduled day, nor the next, nor the week after. He never came back. I can only guess what happened. Maybe he fell ill. He was elderly. Maybe he was discovered by my family and stopped in some way. Maybe he simply gave up, concluding that I was indeed crazy. I'll never know. To this very day, I still don't know what happened to Walter. Did my family get to him? Threaten him? Or did his age just catch up with him? Losing that single human connection that felt lonelier than all the 7 years before it combined. That was the closest I ever came to giving up. The return to complete solitude after this brief period of human contact was devastating. It was the lowest point of all those years. For the first time, I seriously considered ending it all. I had the means, the deep lake, the rusty knife, plants I had discovered were toxic. I even planned it methodically, like the practical nurse I had always been. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the Californian stubbornness, maybe the example of survivors I met in Korea, maybe the certainty that Henry wouldn't approve of that way out. Or maybe, more simply, it was the beautiful sunrise on the morning I had decided to give up. The colors reflected on the lake, the sound of the birds waking up, the smell of the earth after a light overnight rain. I decided that if I had to live there forever, I would at least see all of that one more time. One more day, I promised myself. And then another, and another. And so, day by day, I continued. The routine returned, as did the acceptance. The hope of rescue never completely died, but it was no longer the main driver of my existence. Living well within the circumstances became the goal. Small daily victories, a bountiful harvest, a new successful fishing technique, a more efficient water collection system became my joys. The years continued to pass. 8, 9, 10. Modifications to the cabin transformed it into a structure almost unrecognizable from Charlotte's original design. The interior walls were reinforced with bamboo and mud, the roof repaired countless times with increasingly sophisticated techniques, the porch expanded to accommodate a food drying area. The garden now occupied almost half the island, with improvised but efficient irrigation systems. I developed a calendar of activities based on the seasons: intensive harvesting and food preservation in the summer and fall, structural repairs in the dry winter, planting and expansion in the spring. Each cycle brought its specific challenges and joys. Each year, I became more adapted, more integrated into that small ecosystem that had become my entire world. In the 12th year, another major storm hit the Regio. Unlike the first, I was prepared. The cabin had been reinforced multiple times. I had drainage systems around it, elevated areas to store important items. But what I couldn't predict was the intensity of that specific storm. It was the worst I had ever seen on Lake Oroville. Winds that felt like hurricanes, rain so dense you could barely see a foot in front of you, lightning that turned night into day. The lake turned into a raging sea with enormous waves that swallowed pieces of the island. The cabin trembled as if it would be torn from the ground at any moment. I took refuge in the most reinforced part, which over the years I had turned into a sort of bunker for emergencies just like this. Still, water poured in from all sides. The wind found cracks to howl through. The noise was deafening. At one point, a part of the roof gave way, falling just inches from where I was huddled. It was the longest, most terrifying night since the first storm. I prayed, I cried, I begged, I bargained with every higher power I could imagine. Sometime during the night, exhausted by fear and the effort to keep myself safe, I fell into a restless sleep, filled with nightmares of drowning and abandonment. When I woke up, the silence was the first thing I noticed. After the fury of the storm, that quiet was almost disturbing. I cautiously emerged from the improvised bunker, and what I saw took my breath away. Half of the cabin was simply gone, carried away by the wind, by the water, disintegrated by the force of nature. Walking in a state of shock around the island, I discovered that it too had been profoundly altered. It was visibly smaller, with large chunks eroded by the force of the water. The garden was practically destroyed. Water collection systems were ruined. Years of hard work simply swept away in one night. 12 years. 12 years of building a life from nothing, and in one night, it's washed away. Just when it seems she's hit rock bottom, a new sound appears on the horizon. I sat on what was left of the porch and, for the first time in many years, I cried uncontrollably. It wasn't just the material destruction. It was as if that storm had also washed away my last emotional reserves. I was exhausted, not physically, but in my soul. 12 years of constant struggle, of loneliness, of abandonment. 11 years watching life pass by on the other side of the lake, helpless. How long I sat there crying, hours maybe. The sun was already high when I finally moved. And that's when I noticed something different on the lake. Something I had never seen before, at least not this close. A small, flying object with a blinking light. Years later, I would know it was a drone, but at that moment, it seemed almost alien. The small flying device approached the island, hovering a few feet from where I stood. It had a small camera, I realized. Someone was watching me. I waved frantically, shouted, made every distress signal I knew. The drone stayed for a few minutes, then moved away. Another false hope, I thought bitterly. How many times had I believed I would be saved only to have that hope crushed? I went back to the hard work of trying to salvage what I could from the wreckage, without high expectations. 3 hours later, I heard the unmistakable sound of a boat engine approaching. I looked up in disbelief. It was a large boat, with several people on board. It was approaching the island decisively. It wasn't a boat passing by chance. The boat approached the island cautiously, as if its crew didn't quite know what to expect. I stood at the water's edge, barely believing my eyes. There were 5 people, 3 men, and 2 women, all with equipment I didn't immediately recognize. Cameras, devices, backpacks full of gear. One of them held what I later found out was the drone controller. "Ma'am, are you okay?" shouted one of the men, when the boat was about 20 yards from the shore. The human voice directed at me, after so long, made my throat tighten. I tried to answer, but all I could manage was a strange noise, half a moan, half a sob. I waved frantically, signaling for them to come closer. The boat pulled up to the makeshift shore I had built. A young woman, about 30, with her hair in a ponytail, jumped out first. She approached carefully, like someone approaching a wild, frightened animal. And maybe that's exactly what I looked like. A disheveled old woman, thin as a dry branch, in patched clothes, with white hair down to her waist, skin weathered by the sun like old leather. "My name is Leah," she said, extending her hand. "We're a documentary crew filming about Lake Oroville. We saw you with the drone. Is everything okay? Do you need help?" I opened my mouth to answer, and for the second time, nothing came out. So many years talking to myself or to birds and plants, and now that there were real human beings to talk to, the words escaped me. So, I did the only thing I could. I hugged that stranger as if she were my own reborn daughter. I clung to her like a castaway to a piece of wood, trembling, sobbing, in an explosion of emotion pent up for over a decade. The others approached, alarmed by my reaction. Finally, between sobs, I managed to explain. "My name is Clara May. I'm trapped on this island. And I couldn't finish, overcome by a convulsive cry that shook my whole body. Over a decade of forced solitude came crashing down on me in that instant. The oldest of the group, a man about 50, with a neatly trimmed graying beard, stepped forward. "Ma'am, I'm a doctor, Dr. Paul. May I examine you? You seem to be dehydrated and in a state of shock." I nodded yes, still unable to speak properly. While the doctor checked my vital signs, the others explored what was left of the cabin, expressions of disbelief on their faces. I heard fragments of their conversations. "Living like this. How long? It's not possible. We need to call the authorities." Gradually, I calmed down and was able to tell my story more coherently. I explained who I was, how long I had been there, how I had been abandoned by my family, who planned to kill me to get the ranch. I showed them my improvised diaries, the tools I had created, the survival systems I had developed over the years. As I spoke, their expressions shifted from disbelief to horror. "This is unbelievable," murmured Leah, flipping through my records on tree bark and pieces of wood. "You're saying your own daughter-in-law built this artificial island just to abandon you here, and your son was part of it?" "Exactly," I confirmed, my voice firmer now. "They planned everything. The island far from boating routes, the cabin stocked just enough to seem genuine, no communication, no boat. They knew about my water phobia. They knew I couldn't swim to shore, even though it was relatively close. They wanted me to die here of natural causes so they could inherit the ranch without raising suspicion." The other man on the team, who introduced himself as Martin, the documentary's director, seemed particularly affected. "Ma'am, we have to report this immediately. This is attempted murder, false imprisonment, endangerment. Can I call the police right now?" I nodded yes, feeling a confusing mix of emotions, relief, hope, but also apprehension. After so many false rescues, so many disappointments, I was afraid to believe that I would finally be saved. And at the same time, the thought of facing the outside world after so many years of isolation terrified me almost as much as the water once had. While Martin made the call, I shared more details about how I had survived all those years. The team listened, fascinated, documenting everything with their cameras, with my permission. I showed them my garden, or what was left of it after the storm. I explained the rainwater collection system I had perfected over the decade. I demonstrated the traps for fish and birds I had developed. I pointed to the various distress signals scattered around the island that were never noticed or were deliberately ignored. "It's extraordinary," said the other woman on the team, who introduced herself as Emily, a biologist and researcher. "You applied survival techniques that many professionals would struggle to implement. And all this in your 70 seconds and 80 seconds. You do what you have to do to survive," I replied simply. I learned a lot in the Korean War as a nurse, and even more from watching the local Koreans adapt in extreme conditions, not to mention what I learned growing up in the foothills, where you improvise with what you have. The sheriff's boat arrived about an hour later. 2 deputies, initially skeptical, changed their attitude completely when they saw my diaries. The condition of the cabin clearly adapted for long-term survival, and especially when the documentary crew showed them the footage they had just shot, including my detailed testimony. "Ma'am," one of them said, clearly embarrassed, "we need to take you to a hospital for a full checkup. Then you'll have to give a formal statement. Do you want us to contact any relatives or friends to accompany you?" I laughed bitterly. My only relatives are the ones who abandoned me here, and friends. After 12 years in isolation, I doubt anyone still remembers me. Leah stepped forward. "We'll accompany Mrs. Thompson. And if you'll allow it, we'd like to document the whole process. Your story needs to be told." I nodded. Yes, grateful for the company and support. Before boarding the police boat, I looked one last time at what had been my home, my prison, my entire world for 12 long years. That piece of artificial land, created with such cruel intentions, but which, ironically, had become a testament to my resistance. I picked up a small stone from the shore and put it in the pocket of the rags I called clothes, a tangible reminder of everything I had been through, everything I had overcome. The journey to the shore was surreal. Seeing the lake from that perspective, after years of only looking at it from the edges of the island, caused a mixture of residual fear and fascination. As we approached the shore, I could see the ranch, or what was left of it, from a completely new angle. The main house looked abandoned, with broken windows and an overgrown garden. Several sheds had disappeared completely. And where the main pastures used to be, there was now the skeleton of large buildings, some kind of real estate development, apparently. An ambulance was waiting for us on the shore. The paramedics tried to put me on a stretcher, but I refused. I can still walk on my own 2 feet, kids. I walked for 12 years on that island. I can walk a little more. The documentary crew smiled at my stubbornness, discreetly filming the scene. At the hospital, I underwent an endless battery of tests. The doctors couldn't believe the results. For an 82-year-old woman who had spent over a decade in extreme conditions, my vital signs were surprisingly good. Stabilized blood pressure, strong heart function, muscle mass preserved by constant physical activity. I had nutritional deficiencies, of course, especially of specific vitamins and minerals, but nothing as severe as they expected. "You're an exceptional medical case," said the chief physician, shaking her head in admiration. "The human body's capacity for adaptation is truly incredible." "It's not just the body, doctor. It's the spirit, too," I replied. "The will to live, to prove them wrong, kept me going. That and the memory of my Henry, who wouldn't have wanted to see me give up. During my hospital stay, which lasted only 3 days, I insisted on leaving. I hated being confined after so much time outdoors. The documentary crew rarely left my side. They filmed interviews, collected documents, investigated the ranch's records. Martin, the director, seemed obsessed with piecing the whole story together. "Mrs. Thompson, we found records of parts of the ranch being sold over the years. Your son and daughter-in-law sold almost 80% of the original property. The rest is tied up with a developer who is building a luxury housing community. They claimed you had passed away in 2012. They even presented a death certificate." I wasn't surprised. It was exactly what I had observed from the island year after year. The systematic dismantling of Henry's legacy, of the ranch that was meant to be passed down to future generations, not sold off in pieces to finance the life of luxury Charlotte so desperately wanted. When I left the hospital, a team of lawyers was already waiting for me. They had been contacted by the documentary's production company, which was investing heavily in my story, both to help me and for the journalistic and cinematic potential of the case. "Mrs. Thompson, we have a very strong case for attempted murder, false imprisonment, fraud, forgery of public documents, and several other crimes," explained the lead attorney, Miss Jacobs. "Your son and your daughter-in-law could face decades in prison." The mention of Ethan still hurt, even after everything. "My son was manipulated by Charlotte," I said, without much conviction. "She was always the mastermind behind everything." The lawyer looked at me with compassion. "I understand your desire to protect him, Mrs. Thompson, but the evidence shows he was an active participant. His signatures are on all the sales documents. He was the one who filed your false death certificate. He was the one who received the money from the sales." I swallowed hard. As much as I wanted to believe my son had been just a puppet in his wife's hands, the truth was there, documented, undeniable. Where are they now? I asked. Living in Los Angeles, in a luxury apartment in Beverly Hills. From what we've gathered, they've spent practically all the money from the sales. The apartment is mortgaged, they have significant debts. Your son developed a gambling problem. Your daughter-in-law maintains an unsustainable lifestyle. They are practically bankrupt, despite the millions they received from the ranch sales. The irony was almost poetic. The crime they committed against me hadn't even secured the life of wealth they so desired. They had thrown away the heritage built by generations of Thompsons. And for what? To end up in debt, and soon, possibly in prison. The first time I saw my son and daughter-in-law after 12 years was in a courtroom. The judge had ordered a preliminary hearing where I would tell my version of the facts in front of them before the formal proceedings. The documentary crew received special permission to film, given the public interest in the case. Ethan and Charlotte entered, escorted by deputies, not because they were under arrest yet, but as a security measure, given the emotional climate of the meeting. My son looked like he had aged 30 years instead of 12. His hair was completely gray, his face marked with deep wrinkles, dark circles under his eyes, his body stooped. Charlotte, on the other hand, maintained her usual well-kept appearance, despite also showing the passage of years. She was dressed as if for a social gathering, not a hearing where she would be accused of attempted murder. When they saw me, sitting there next to the lawyers, they had distinct reactions. Ethan turned pale as if he were seeing a ghost, which, in a way, was true, since for all intents and purposes, they considered me dead. Charlotte kept her face impassive, but her eyes widened for a second, the only visible sign of shock. "Mom," Ethan's voice was a trembling thread. "How did I survive, son?" I replied, my voice firmer than I expected. "Despite all your efforts to prevent it," Charlotte was quick to compose herself. "What is this nonsense? We were devastated when you disappeared. We searched everywhere." The judge intervened before I could respond. "Miss Thompson, I suggest you do not make any statements without your lawyer's guidance. The accusations are extremely serious." My testimony lasted almost 3 hours. I told everything, from the first mention of the island as a birthday present, to the planned abandonment, to the 12 years of survival, watching from a distance as the ranch was dismantled. I showed my diaries, the photos of the island taken by the documentary crew, the meticulous records I kept even in the most adverse conditions. The whole time, Ethan kept his head down, occasionally looking up at me with an expression that mixed horror, shame, and something else, anger, perhaps, or just shock at seeing his plan fall apart. Charlotte, on the other hand, maintained a defensive posture, frequently whispering to her lawyer, taking notes, clearly planning her defense. When I finished my account, the judge asked if the accused would like to make any preliminary statements. Their lawyer advised silence at that moment, but Charlotte ignored the advice. "This is all the delusion of an elderly woman with dementia," she exclaimed, her voice shrill, like someone cornered. "We built the island as a retreat for her, at her own request. She always said she wanted a place of her own, away from everything. When she disappeared, we thought she had an accident, maybe fell into the lake. We searched for weeks. It was such a blatant, easily refutable lie that I almost laughed." The lawyers immediately presented the documents that proved otherwise: the false death certificate, the ranch sales, initiated just 3 months after my disappearance, the fact that they never filed a police report, never called the fire department or police to conduct a search. Ethan finally looked up, not at me, but at Charlotte. There was something different in his eyes now, a kind of resolution, as if he had made a difficult decision. "Enough lies," he said, his voice low but firm. "She's right, we planned everything. The truth." In a crowded courtroom, the lie finally shatters. Ethan's confession seals their fate, but it also opens a new, painful chapter for Clara. How do you move forward when your own son admits to planning your murder? Stay with us for the verdict. Charlotte turned to him in disbelief. "Shut up, Ethan." The lawyer said not to say anything, but he continued, ignoring her and the frantic gestures of the lawyer. "It was Charlotte's idea, but I agreed to everything. We were in debt because of my gambling addiction. We needed the money from the ranch. Mom would never agree to sell. She was too attached to that land. So, Charlotte devised the island plan. She said it was perfect. Mom had a phobia of water. She would never swim to shore. She was supposed to die in a few days, without her blood pressure medicine, without adequate food. We never imagined she would survive for over a decade there. The silence that followed was so thick you could almost touch it. Charlotte looked at Ethan as if she wanted to kill him right there. Their lawyer looked like he was about to have a heart attack. The judge, who had probably heard everything in his career, seemed genuinely shocked. "Mr. Thompson," he said finally, "are you aware that you have just confessed in a recorded hearing to your participation in an attempted murder against your own mother?" Ethan nodded slowly. "I am, and I deserve to be punished for it. I've spent the last 12 years tormented by what we did. Every time I looked at that island, knowing there was probably a decaying body there. But I was too much of a coward to check, to face what I had done." Tears were now streaming freely down his face. They weren't tears of self-pity, I realized, but of genuine, deep remorse that had likely been eating him up from the inside for years. Charlotte, on the other hand, seemed to have given up maintaining her facade of innocence, and now looked with pure hatred at her husband, at me, at everyone in the room. The judge ordered them both into custody pending trial, given the severity of the accusations and Ethan's confession. As they were being led away, my son looked at me one last time. "Forgive me, Mom," he whispered. "I know I don't deserve it anymore." I didn't answer. I didn't know what to feel, what to say. Part of me wanted to hug him, to say I understood the pressure he was under, Charlotte's manipulation. Another part wanted to scream, to demand that he suffer as I had suffered, abandoned, forgotten, fighting for survival day after day for 12 long years. I remained silent, leaving the decision for a time when my heart and mind were less tumultuous. How do you forgive your own flesh and blood for trying to murder you? But then, how do you completely hate the boy you once held in your arms, the son I knew was drowning in his wife's ambition and his own weakness, forgiveness? It ain't a light switch. It's an old wound. It still aches on cold days. You just learn to live with the pain. In the following weeks, my story exploded in the media. The documentary, still in production, already had clips released on TV channels, social media, newspapers. The castaway of Lake Oroville, they called me. The Sacramento survivor, the mother-in-law's revenge. Each outlet created a more sensationalist nickname than the last. I, who had spent 12 years without seeing or speaking to almost anyone, was suddenly everywhere. Interviews, TV shows, podcasts, everyone wanted to hear my story. How did I survive? How did I maintain my sanity? Did I hold a grudge against my family? What were the first days on the island like? The questions were endless, and I surprisingly found that I didn't mind answering. Telling my story was almost therapeutic, and if it could inspire other people to never give up, even in the most adverse circumstances, then it was worth sharing. What surprised me most were the reactions. People cried hearing my story. Others expressed outrage, wanting immediate justice, severe sentences for Ethan and Charlotte. Some identified with specific aspects: the abandonment, the family betrayal, the struggle for survival. I received letters, emails, which I learned to use quickly, adaptable as I've always been. Even gifts from strangers moved by my story. The court case moved forward quickly. With Ethan's confession and the overwhelming evidence, there wasn't much room for doubt. Charlotte maintained her stance of denial until the end, claiming she had been manipulated by Ethan, that she didn't know the full plan, that she thought I had died in an accident. No one believed her, of course. All evidence pointed to her as the main architect of the plan. Ethan, on the other hand, took full responsibility. In his formal testimony, he detailed how it all began with gambling debts, how Charlotte pressured him to find a solution, how the idea of the island came up during a visit to a lakeside resort, how they meticulously planned every detail to make it seem like a genuine gift. "And after you left her there, how did you manage to live normally?" asked the prosecutor, visibly disgusted. Ethan lowered his head. "We didn't live normally. There wasn't a single day I didn't think about what we did. I drank to forget, gambled to not think. Charlotte, she seemed to handle it better. She said it was necessary, that Mom had already lived a long life, that she wouldn't suffer much. I pretended to believe her, because it was easier than facing the truth. While the trial was underway, I had other practical concerns. Where would I live? What would I live on? The ranch was largely lost, legally sold, even if under false pretenses. The money from the sales squandered by Ethan and Charlotte. All that remained was the main house of the ranch and a few acres around it, and even those were in an advanced state of neglect. That's when Leah, from the documentary crew, made me a surprising offer. "Mrs. Thompson, the production company is willing to buy the rights to your story for a feature film in addition to the documentary. It would be a considerable sum, enough to renovate the main house of the ranch and have a reserve to live comfortably." The idea of commercializing my suffering initially made me uncomfortable, but after thinking about it, I realized it wasn't about money. It was about telling my story as widely as possible, perhaps helping other people find strength in desperate situations. And pragmatically, I accepted the offer. The payment for the rights, combined with an online crowdfunding campaign that spontaneously emerged after the first reports, allowed me to begin the restoration of the ranch house. It wouldn't be the same Hopewell Ranch as before. The pastures, the herds, and the creamery had been lost, but I was determined to rebuild what I could. But it could be a new beginning, a place to spend my final years in peace. During the renovation, I made sure to incorporate elements from my experience on the island: rainwater collection systems, a large organic garden, the use of natural materials and sustainable solutions. The hired architect, a talented young woman, nothing like Charlotte, was fascinated by my primitive but ingenious ideas, as she described them. "You're decades ahead in terms of sustainability," she commented, impressed with my composting system based on what I had developed on the island. "These techniques you created out of necessity are exactly what green architects are trying to implement today." The trial finally concluded almost a year after my rescue. The sentence for Charlotte was severe: 20 years for attempted murder, fraud, forgery of public documents, and several other crimes. For Ethan, considering his confession, remorse, and cooperation with the justice system, the sentence was shorter. 12 years, ironically, the same amount of time I spent on the island. After the sentencing, I finally had the private conversation with my son that I had been putting off. In the prison visiting room, separated by glass, we looked like two strangers. The man in front of me barely resembled the boy I raised, the young man full of dreams who was once supposed to take over his father's ranch. "Mom," he began, his voice choked. "I know I have no right to ask for anything, but I need to say it. I'm sorry, more than I can express." I looked at him for a long time, searching his downcast eyes for any sign of the Ethan I once knew. It was there, buried under layers of remorse, shame, and defeat. "Why, Ethan? Why did it come to this?" He sighed deeply. "It started with small gambling debts, bets with friends. Then it grew, got out of control. When Charlotte found out, I already owed a lot of money to dangerous people. She said selling parts of the ranch was the only solution. You would never agree. So," he couldn't finish the sentence. "So you decided to get rid of me," I completed, my voice calmer than I expected. "It was Charlotte who suggested the island. She said it would be perfect. UD of natural causes. No one would suspect." I didn't have the courage to disagree. I was desperate, afraid of the creditors, addicted to gambling, manipulated by her. "I'm not making excuses, Mom. What we did is unforgivable. I just want you to understand how we got there." We were silent for a few minutes. Me, digesting his words. He, apparently waiting for an explosion of anger that never came. "You know," I said finally, "for 12 years on that island, I had a lot of time to think about you, about Charlotte, about what you did. In the beginning, it was just anger, hatred, really. I planned elaborate revenges. I imagined you suffering as I suffered. But over time, something changed. I realized that spending my energy hating you was just giving you more power over me. So I decided to focus on surviving, on winning, in spite of you, not against you. Ethan looked at me with a mixture of admiration and incomprehension. How can you talk like that after everything we've been through? I would have gone crazy if it were me. I almost did go crazy, son, many times. But life has a strange way of teaching us things. That island that was supposed to be my death ended up being a school of life. I learned more about myself, about resilience, about what really matters than in all the years before. And now? He asked hesitantly. What happens between us? The question I had been asking myself for months. What to do with this son who tried to kill me, but who was also the boy I once held in my arms? The man who betrayed my trust in the worst possible way, but who also carried Henry's blood, the Thompson name. I don't know, Ethan, I answered honestly. I don't know if I can completely forgive what you did. I don't know if we can ever have any kind of relationship again. But I'm also not going to spend the rest of my days hating you. I've already lost too much time on negative feelings on that island. He nodded, tears streaming freely. I understand. I deserve that and much more. I just want you to know that if you can ever even consider giving me a second chance, I'll do everything to earn it. The visit ended, and I left the prison with a heavy heart, but somehow lighter. I hadn't completely forgiven. I didn't know if I ever could. But I had opened a small door to the possibility of, in the future, rebuilding something with my son. Not the mother-son relationship from before, which was irreparably broken, but perhaps something new, based not on a shared past, but on the painful truth we now knew. The documentary crew, who had accompanied me throughout the entire process, finally finished the film. Clara's Island premiered at a major film festival, winning awards and enthusiastic reviews. More than a documentary about survival, it was a reflection on betrayal, resilience, aging, family, and redemption. I watched it sitting in the front row between Leah and Martin, seeing my story told to the world, my suffering transformed into inspiration for others. The film ended with images of me at the restored ranch, tending to the new garden, watching the sunset from the porch, the same porch from which, years before, I had left to see the birthday surprise that would change my life forever. The final scene showed a small wooden boat I had built and anchored on the lake, visible from the porch, a symbol that the fear of water that had been used against me had finally been overcome. In the months following the premiere, I received invitations to speak at universities, schools, conventions. People wanted to hear about survival techniques, emotional resilience, forgiveness, and new beginnings. Each speech was an opportunity to give meaning to what I had lived, to turn pain into something useful for others. A journalist asked me after one of these talks, Mrs. Thompson, if you could go back and change something, what would it be? Would you have avoided trusting your son and daughter-in-law? Would you have noticed the signs earlier? I reflected for a moment before answering. You know, my dear, I don't think I would change anything. It sounds crazy, doesn't it? But if I hadn't gone through all that, I wouldn't be who I am today. I wouldn't have discovered my own strength. I wouldn't have all these stories to tell, all these lessons to share. I would have just continued being an old lady on a ranch, waiting for time to pass. Instead, I gained a new life, a new purpose. Of course, the price was high, and I wouldn't wish this experience on anyone. But since it happened to me, well, I'm going to get as much meaning out of it as possible. As the documentary gained worldwide recognition, my story inspired other people in desperate situations. I received letters from survivors of other types of abandonment, from people fighting against seemingly impossible conditions. Each of these stories moved me deeply and reaffirmed my decision to share my experience openly. 6 months after the trial, I received an unexpected letter. It was from Charlotte, written from the women's penitentiary where she was serving her sentence. I hesitated for a long time before opening it. What could she possibly want after everything? More lies? Some final manipulation? The letter was short and to the point. Mrs. Thompson, I don't expect your forgiveness. I know it's impossible. I won't pretend to be remorseful. We both know that would be a lie. I'm writing only to say that you won. You not only survived, but you thrived. You're rich, famous, admired. I'm here with nothing and no one. I spent my life trying to get rid of you, and in the end, you're the one who is free. It wasn't a request for forgiveness, not even an attempt at reconciliation. It was the final admission of defeat, the reluctant acknowledgement that all her plans had failed. Somehow, that letter gave me a kind of closure that no trial or sentence could provide. That same day, I received another piece of mail, an invitation to visit a primary school where the children had watched an age-appropriate, edited version of the documentary and wanted to meet me. I put Charlotte's letter in a drawer and never read it again. The past was closed. The future, surprisingly, still had much to offer. Hopewell Ranch, even in its reduced and modified version, came back to life not as a producer of milk and cheese, but as an educational center where I taught survival techniques, sustainability, and organic farming. Schools scheduled visits. Families came on weekends to learn about rainwater harvesting, solar energy, composting. Every person who left there, taking with them a little of the knowledge I had acquired the hard way on the island, was a small personal victory. On quiet days, sitting on the porch watching the sunset, I still thought about the island, not with horror or resentment, but almost with a strange nostalgia. That piece of artificial land, created to be my prison and my tomb, had ironically become the place where I discovered my true strength, my deepest essence. In a sense, I left a part of myself there, the fragile, dependent woman who was afraid of water, who trusted blindly, who lived in the shadow of others' expectations. The island had been physically destroyed by the last major storm, I was informed. The artificial structure, without proper maintenance, could not withstand the forces of nature. In a way, it seemed fitting. It had served its purpose, both the evil one intended by Charlotte and the unexpected one of me becoming someone stronger. Now it could return to the waters of Lake Oroville, leaving only the story I carried. When I was finally able to confront my own son, who had been manipulated into participating in the plan to kill me, I chose to offer a chance for redemption instead of complete revenge. The trial of Charlotte and Ethan became one of the most emblematic criminal cases in Sacramento's history. During the hearings, which lasted for almost 2 months, all the details of the plot came to light. Ethan's gambling debts, Charlotte's unbridled ambition, the meticulous planning of the artificial island, the forgery of my death certificate, the fraudulent sales of the ranch. The prosecution left no stone unturned. What impacted the jury the most, however, were the diaries I kept over the 12 years. Improvised sheets of paper, tree bark with inscriptions, boards scratched with charcoal, all meticulously preserved and dated, forming a chronological record of my abandonment and survival. The prosecutor even read excerpts aloud during the trial, and I saw jurors crying as they listened to my desperate words from the first few months, the gradual acceptance in the middle, and the internal transformation in the final years. These are not just records of physical survival, the prosecutor argued in her closing statement. They are testaments to the indomitable human resilience in the face of the most terrible of betrayals, family betrayal, Mrs. Thompson not only survived the defendant's murderous plan, she transcended the limitations imposed on her, turning a death sentence into a journey of self-discovery. Charlotte remained cold and calculating until the end. When given the right to speak, she limited herself to denying any homicidal intent, claiming the island was built as a genuine gift and that she deeply regretted the apparent misunderstanding. Her lack of remorse only served to harden the stance of the jury and the judge even further. Ethan, on the other hand, took full responsibility. His final statement was a public plea for forgiveness, not just to me, but to his father's memory. I betrayed everything my parents taught me, everything that Hopewell Ranch represented. I don't ask for mercy, only the opportunity to one day try to repair a fraction of the harm I caused. The sentence came on a rainy April afternoon. Charlotte was sentenced to 22 years in prison for attempted murder, fraud, document forgery, and other lesser crimes. Ethan, benefiting from his confession and cooperation with the justice system, received a sentence of 12 years with the possibility of parole after 4 years. Justice is served. But listen to that sentence. 12 years for Ethan, a year for every year Clara was imprisoned. The symmetry is chilling. But what happens after the sentence? The judge's next words will change everything for Clara and her son. The judge, in his decision, did something unusual. In addition to the conventional sentence, he ordered a kind of social reparation for Ethan. When he was on parole, he would have to work on a rehabilitation project for Hopewell Ranch, helping to restore it under my supervision, if I so permitted. It was a form of restorative justice rarely seen in such serious cases. Mrs. Clara Thompson lost 12 years of her life, the judge declared. No sentence can give them back, but perhaps through the reconstruction of what was destroyed, we can offer a form of reparation that goes beyond simple punishment. With the trial over, the challenge of rebuilding my life began. The once thriving ranch was in a pitiful state. The main house, abandoned for years, had a broken roof, leaks, termites. The creamery sheds had been practically dismantled, the equipment sold off piece by piece. The pastures, without proper maintenance, were overgrown with invasive plants. And the prize-winning herd that Henry and I had genetically selected for decades was completely dispersed, sold to different ranches across the country. But I had something I didn't have when I was abandoned on the island: visibility. The documentary Clara's Island, even while still in post-production, already had clips circulating on the internet, generating a national conversation. Journalists sought me out daily. TV shows competed for exclusive interviews. My story touched a raw nerve in society: the neglect of the elderly, family greed, the unexpected strength that can emerge in the most adverse circumstances. It was Leah, the documentary producer who had become a close friend, who suggested a crowdfunding campaign. "Mrs. Thompson, there are thousands of people who want to help rebuild the ranch. Why not let them be part of this restoration?" I was initially reluctant. I had never been one to ask for help, and spending 12 years alone on an island only reinforced that independence. But Leah made me see that it wasn't about charity, but about collective restorative justice. People wanted to be part of rebuilding something that had been destroyed by greed. They wanted to participate in a story of redemption. The campaign was launched with an initial goal of $150,000, enough for the most urgent repairs to the house and basic structures. In 48 hours, it raised $1 million. By the end of a week, it reached almost $2.5 million, with donations coming from all over the United States and even abroad. The most significant, surprisingly, came from a consortium of small cheese producers from California. $500,000, specifically for the reconstruction of the creamery. "Mrs. Clara Thompson," said the letter that accompanied the donation, "your artisanal Monterey Jack with wild herbs inspired a whole generation of Californian producers. It is our duty to ensure that this tradition is not lost." I didn't know my cheeses had that kind of reach, that impact. During the years on the island, watching the ranch being dismantled from a distance, I imagined that all our work, all our recipes, all the processes we developed had been lost forever. To discover that there was a living legacy that continued to inspire other producers was as emotional as the rescue itself. With the resources from the campaign, added to the substantial payment for the film rights to my story, I was able to begin the reconstruction of Hopewell Ranch far more ambitiously than I ever could have imagined. I didn't just want to restore it to what it was before. I wanted to transform it into something new that incorporated everything I learned during those 12 years of forced isolation. I hired a mixed team: contemporary architects working alongside masters of traditional crafts, agricultural engineers specializing in soil recovery, along with local family farmers who had mastered ancestral cultivation techniques. The goal was to create a ranch that combined the best of tradition with sustainable innovations, many of them based on the improvised solutions I developed on the island. The main house was restored respecting the original California mission-style architecture that Henry loved so much, but incorporating modern systems for rainwater harvesting, solar energy, and natural ventilation. The creamery sheds were rebuilt following strict sanitary standards, but maintaining artisanal processes. The pastures were recovered using agroforestry techniques I learned from observing natural regeneration on the island. As for the herd, it was an emotional surprise. When the news of the ranch's reconstruction spread, producers who had bought our cows during the dismantling started showing up. Some offered direct descendants of those animals, Others proposed partnerships for breeding. In less than a year, we had a small but promising nucleus of dairy cattle with the same genetics that Henry and I had developed over decades. The cheese production restarted on a modest scale, but with the same meticulous care as before. I recovered the traditional Thompson family recipes, including the award-winning Monterey Jack with wild herbs, and added new varieties inspired by my experience on the island, like the Survivor's cheese, aged with wild bee propolis, which quickly became our most sought-after product. But the reborn ranch was not just a business. From the beginning, I wanted it to also be an educational space, a center for sharing the knowledge I acquired the hard way. I created the Clara's Island Learning Center, a pavilion dedicated to workshops on survival techniques, sustainability, regenerative agriculture, and artisanal food processing. Schools scheduled visits, university students came to do research, families participated in weekend workshops. I personally taught many of the workshops: how to make fire without matches, how to identify medicinal plants of the region, how to purify water in adverse conditions, how to improvise tools with available materials. Each technique that had kept me alive on the island now became shared knowledge, a legacy for future generations. And the island itself? After intense debate with environmental authorities, we decided not to rebuild it exactly as it was. It would reinforce the traumatic aspect, besides requiring constant artificial interventions in the lake. Instead, we created a small floating pier on the spot where it existed, with a minimalist structure that served as a memorial and observation point, a contemplative space where visitors could reflect on resilience, solitude, and overcoming adversity. A discreet plaque briefly told my story and ended with a phrase that became almost a mantra for me. What was created to destroy can be transformed into a source of strength when faced with courage and determination. The documentary Clara's Island, completed about 18 months after my rescue, premiered at the Sundance Film Festival, winning the awards for Best Documentary and the Audience Choice. From there, it had an impressive international run: Berlin, Toronto, accumulating awards and, more importantly, bringing my story to global audiences. Martin, the director, had done an exceptional job, combining the footage of the island after my rescue, interviews with me and people involved in the case, archival images of the ranch in its glory days, and even careful recreations of key moments from my 12 years of isolation. The result was a powerful film that transcended the merely sensationalist aspect it could have had, becoming a universal reflection on abandonment, survival, and personal transformation. The success of the documentary brought offers for film adaptations, books, series. I carefully selected the projects I would participate in, always with the condition of maintaining control over the narrative. I didn't want my story to be distorted or sensationalized. The most significant agreement was with a renowned publisher for my autobiography, Castaway on Dry Land, which I wrote with the help of a respected journalist over 2 years. The book became a bestseller and was translated into 27 languages. All this attention also brought responsibilities. I became, without planning it, a kind of spokesperson for issues of active aging, female resilience, and practical sustainability. I received invitations to speak at universities, medical congresses, and corporate events. At 84, I discovered a new calling as a communicator, sharing not only my personal story, but the deep reflections that emerged from those long years of isolation. What forced solitude taught me, I often said in my talks, was that we are never truly alone when we maintain a connection with nature, with our purpose, with our own inner strength. True isolation happens when we lose these essential bonds, even when surrounded by people. One of the most unexpected consequences of my return was the impact on the scientific community. Researchers from various fields became interested in the survival systems I developed on the island, the physiological and psychological adaptations I experienced, and the improvised solutions I created. I participated in studies on resilience in the elderly, on water purification techniques in extreme conditions, on medicinal plants of the foothills, and on psychological adaptation to prolonged isolation. A group of geriatricians from Stanford University conducted a series of comprehensive exams and were impressed with my physical and mental condition after those years of deprivation. You defy everything we know about aging under adverse conditions, the lead researcher told me. Your capacity for adaptation and regeneration is extraordinary. Perhaps the most surprising aspect of my new life was the transformation of my relationship with water. The phobia that had accompanied me since childhood and that Charlotte had so cruelly exploited had transformed into something different, a deep, almost reverential respect. It was no longer paralyzing terror, but an intimate understanding of the dual power of water. Its capacity to destroy, yes, but also to sustain, to nourish, to transform. I learned to swim properly, something I had never been able to do before. I started with basic lessons in a shallow pool, slowly progressing until I felt comfortable in deeper water. At 85, to everyone's astonishment and my own, I swam for the first time in Lake Oroville. Not a full crossing, of course, but enough to symbolize the definitive overcoming of the fear that almost killed me. The water that was used to imprison me, I commented to the journalists who recorded the moment, now sets me free. That is the greatest victory I could have over those who tried to destroy me. This is the moment of true victory. Not in the courtroom, but right here. At 85, Clara reclaims the very element that was meant to be her tomb. She didn't just survive, she conquered. Her final act of liberation is coming up. My relationship with my son remained complex, painful, but slowly evolving. During the first years of his sentence, I visited him monthly in prison. Our conversations were difficult, laden with guilt on his part, and residual hurt on mine. But there were also moments of genuine connection, especially when we talked about Henry, about the ranch as it was before, about old memories that predated Charlotte's arrival in our lives. Ethan actively participated in rehabilitation programs in prison, therapy for his gambling addiction, vocational courses, volunteer work. He completed a technical course in dairy production, studied sustainable management, learned environmental recovery techniques, clearly preparing for the moment he could participate in the ranch's reconstruction, as stipulated in his sentence. "I don't expect your complete forgiveness, Mom," he told me during one of these visits. "I know some things can't be fully repaired, but I want to at least try to rebuild some of what I destroyed, not for me, but for you, for Dad, for the family legacy." When he finally progressed to a halfway house, 4 years after his conviction, the time came to decide whether to accept the social reparation clause proposed by the judge. Allowing Ethan to work on the ranch's recovery was a difficult decision, debated at length with my therapists. Yes, at 86 I started regular therapy, something I should have done much earlier with the legal team and with close friends like Leah and Martin. In the end, I agreed, establishing clear conditions. Ethan would work only in specific areas of the ranch, under constant supervision. He would have no access to bank accounts or important documents. He would participate in regular family therapy sessions, and any sign of relapse into problematic behavior would result in the immediate revocation of the agreement. His arrival at the ranch was a tense moment. The employees, many of whom knew the whole story, watched him with suspicion. Regular visitors to the educational center whispered when they recognized him. Ethan himself seemed to shrink under the weight of the stares, the history, the guilt he carried. I initially assigned him to work on recovering the degraded pastures, a physically demanding and symbolically appropriate job. He was literally replanting what he had torn out, regenerating what he had destroyed. In the first few months, we interacted minimally, only what was necessary to coordinate tasks. Gradually, however, something began to change. I saw in him a genuine commitment to the reconstruction, a dedication that went beyond legal obligation. He worked tirelessly, often beyond the required hours. He studied environmental recovery techniques in his spare time, proposed improvements, solved practical problems with surprising ingenuity. In many ways, he reminded me of the young Ethan before the addiction, before Charlotte, creative, hard-working, connected to the land. A year after his return to the ranch, a significant moment occurred. During a severe storm, part of the newly rebuilt creamery roof gave way, threatening to damage expensive equipment. Ethan spontaneously led the emergency efforts, working all night in the pouring rain to protect the structure, mobilizing other employees, improvising solutions with available materials. It was exactly the kind of crisis response I learned on the island, the same combination of calm under pressure and practical creativity. The next morning, as we inspected the limited damage thanks to the quick action, our eyes met in a different way. We didn't exchange words, but something was communicated. A mutual recognition, perhaps, that some essential Thompson DNA still existed in him, despite everything. Charlotte, on the other hand, remained unyielding in her stance. She refused all rehabilitation opportunities in prison. She filed multiple legal appeals, claiming innocence. She even tried to sue me for defamation when the documentary was released. I never responded to the occasional letters she sent, manipulative missives that alternated between victimization, veiled threats, and false displays of remorse. She was completely out of my life, and so she would remain. Ethan eventually divorced her, a process he initiated from prison. It was another sign of his break with the past, with the toxic influence that had led him to that terrible situation. When he told me, he seemed lighter, as if he had finally cut the last tie to the spiral of self-destruction he had fallen into. The ranch, meanwhile, flourished beyond the most optimistic expectations. 2 years after restarting production, our cheeses once again won national awards. The School for Survival and Sustainability Techniques attracted students from all over the country and even abroad. The Island Memorial received visitors daily, becoming a point of reflection on resilience and overcoming adversity. I hired a young, dynamic team for day-to-day management, but maintained active supervision in all areas. At 87, I still woke up with the sun, made a point of participating in the production of special cheeses, and personally taught the most popular classes at the educational center. The energy that many found surprising for my age was, to me, just the natural result of a life that had learned to value each day as if it were the last which, on the island, any day could have been. The deepest and most lasting impact of that extreme experience, however, was internal. Forced solitude taught me lessons I would never have learned otherwise. About self-reliance, the ability to depend entirely on my own resources when there is no alternative. About patience, accepting that some processes cannot be rushed, that nature has its own time. About adaptability, the willingness to abandon old certainties when new circumstances require different solutions. Perhaps the most valuable lesson was about priorities. When you live with so little for so long, the difference between need and desire becomes crystal clear. The things we think are essential are revealed to be superfluous. What really matters emerges with clarity. Back in civilization, I maintained that perspective. I lived comfortably, yes, but without excess, without waste, with a deep gratitude for every little luxury I once took for granted. The unexpected fame that came with my story brought opportunities I never imagined in my life. I was invited to speak at international conferences, received honors from universities, even a Medal of Honor from the governor for the extraordinary example of human resilience. I met fascinating people, visited places I only knew from books. I experienced the kind of recognition that rarely comes to elderly women in our society. But the most precious moments continued to be the simplest ones. The taste of the first cheese produced at the rebuilt ranch, the sunrise seen from the porch, so different and yet so reminiscent of the dawns I watched on the island. The feeling of damp earth in my hands as I planted seedlings in the new garden. The satisfaction of teaching survival techniques to young people who, I hope, will never need to use them in the extreme circumstances in which I learned them. And there was Ethan. Our relationship would never be what it was before. Some breaks are irreparable. Some betrayals leave permanent scars. But we were slowly building something new, not based on the idealization of mother and son, but on a mutual recognition of flaws, frailties, and the possibilities of redemption. He worked tirelessly on the ranch, gradually taking on more responsibilities as he proved his reliability. We participated in family therapy sessions together, unearthing painful truths, confronting dysfunctional patterns that went back generations. In one of these therapy sessions, already in the 3rd year of his work at the ranch, he asked me something that had clearly been tormenting him for a long time. "Mom, have you really forgiven me, or do you just tolerate my presence as part of the sentence?" I took a deep breath before answering. "Ethan, I spent many years on the island thinking about forgiveness. I concluded that it's not something simple. It's not a single moment where everything magically resolves. It's a process with advances and setbacks. There are days when I look at you and see only my son, the boy I raised with so much love. Other days, the memory of the abandonment comes back with full force and the hurt reappears. I'm learning to live with this duality, and you need to learn to live with it too. He nodded slowly, his eyes welling up. It's more than I deserve, he said simply. It's not about what you deserve, I replied. If it were about deserving, we'd all be lost at some point. It's about what I choose to give, the kind of person I choose to be. On the island, I learned that holding a grudge is a luxury that consumes more energy than it generates benefit. I didn't forgive you for your sake, Ethan. I did it for mine. It was a difficult but necessary conversation. In the following months, I noticed a subtle change in him. Less anxiety to prove his worth, more acceptance of the consequences of his actions, a greater willingness for the patient work of reconstruction, not just of the ranch, but of himself. When I turned 88, Hopewell Ranch held a special event, the launch of a new cheese, the Legacy, created specifically to celebrate the date. It was a complex, long-aged cheese that combined traditional Thompson family techniques with innovations I developed on the island. The packaging featured a photo of me as a young woman, next to Henry, and another recent one at the rebuilt ranch. During the launch ceremony, which was attended by officials, journalists, and many admirers, Ethan surprised me with a significant gesture. He went up on stage and, in front of everyone, handed me a small object, the original golden key to the island cabin, which he had kept all those years. This key, he said, his voice choked but firm, was conceived as a symbol of imprisonment. Today, I return it as a symbol of liberation. Not just yours, Mom, who won this freedom with a strength I never imagined possible, but also my own from the cycle of destruction that almost consumed us all. The key, the symbol of her prison, now returned as a symbol of liberation. It's a long, painful road to forgiveness, but this is the first step. Clara's story is one of survival, but as we'll hear in her final reflections, it's truly a story of rebirth. I received the key with contained emotion. It was an object laden with painful memories, but also with a transformative meaning. I decided it would have a special place in the island's memorial, not hidden, not denied, but integrated into the broader narrative of survival and rebirth. That night, alone on the main house porch, I reflected on the extraordinary journey I had lived. From a poor girl in Grass Valley to a war nurse in Korea, from a producer of award-winning cheeses to a castaway on an artificial island, from a determined survivor to an inspiration for thousands. A life that, at 88, continued to unfold in surprising directions. I looked out at Lake Oroville, shimmering under the moonlight. The water that had been my prison, my greatest fear, my constant challenge for 12 years, now seemed like an old friend, familiar in its mood swings, respected in its dual power to create and destroy. Just like life itself, I thought, unpredictable, sometimes cruel, but always with the potential for transformation and renewal for those who have the courage to face it on its own terms. The story of the island was not just about physical survival. It was about finding purpose in suffering, meaning in trial, growth in extreme adversity. It was about discovering late in life an inner strength that had always been there, waiting to be summoned by necessity. Perhaps that was the most important message I could share. We never know what we are capable of until circumstances demand more than we believe we can give. A 70-year-old woman, with a phobia of water and health problems, abandoned on an island to die, not only survived for 12 years, but emerged stronger, wiser, more complete. This is not a story about victimization, but about transcendence. Not about what was taken from me, but about what I discovered within myself when everything else was removed. Not about revenge against those who tried to destroy me, but about rebuilding something more meaningful from the ruins they left behind. Some ask me if, given the chance, I would erase those 12 years of my life. The answer always surprises them. No, I wouldn't. They were terrible years, yes, full of loneliness, fear, and deprivation. But they were also years of self-discovery, of deep connection with nature, of lessons that no school could provide. I emerged from that island not just as a survivor, but as a more authentic version of myself, stripped of the layers of social conditioning, external expectations, and the limiting fears I had carried since childhood. In today's culture, which values youth, speed, and hyperconnection so much, my story offers a necessary counterpoint. It shows that old age can be a time not of decline, but of surprising strength, that forced disconnection can lead to deeper reconnections with what truly matters, that the slowness imposed by circumstances can provide a clarity that constant rushing never would. Today, at 88, I live each day with a gratitude that only someone who has been close to death can fully comprehend. Every sunrise is a gift, every shared meal, a celebration, every new lesson, a victory against the limiting expectations about aging. The Reborn Ranch has become not just a thriving business or an innovative educational center, but a living symbol that it is always possible to start over, no matter how devastating the destruction. Ethan continues his rehabilitation process, working on the ranch, actively participating in the reconstruction of what he helped destroy. Our relationship, though it will never be what it was, has found a new form more honest, perhaps, without the mutual idealizations that contributed to the tragedy. There is a long road ahead, but for the first time in a long time, I feel that we are both walking in the same direction, even if at different paces. The documentary continues to gain worldwide recognition, inspiring discussions about resilience, active aging, and complex family relationships. The book will be adapted into a feature film with a renowned American actress playing my saga. The educational center at the ranch expands its activities each year, bringing the knowledge I acquired on the island to an ever wider audience. When I look back at the long road that brought me here, I see a life that, despite all the pain and betrayals, was profoundly worth living. A life that in its third act, when many expect only a quiet decline, found its deepest purpose, its most authentic expression. The island that was meant to be my tomb ironically became the cradle of my rebirth. The water that was meant to be my prison transformed into a path to the most essential freedom, that of one who faced her deepest fear and discovered that beyond it lies an ocean of unexplored possibilities. Charlotte's 22-year sentence and Ethan's 12-year sentence cannot give me back the time I lost. But the truth is, I don't need it back. I used that time. I turned my prison into my classroom, turned fear into fuel, and turned solitude into strength. They tried to erase the name Clara Mae Thompson. Instead, they made me immortal. Now, my story is not about an abandoned victim. It is a testament, living proof, that even in the darkest of betrayals, a resilient woman's flame can still burn bright and ignite an entire legacy.